Hey gays, tonight, the village of Dubrovka was a place carved from tradition and cold stone, where the winter wind was the loudest voice and the Tsar's decree the heaviest weight. For years, Jan Kowalski, a blacksmith whose hands bore the permanent scars of hot iron, had felt the crown's heavy grip tighten. The taxes were an anchor, pulling his family deeper into debt, and the forced conscription of young men into the endless, distant wars had stolen the sons of his neighbors. Jan's own son, Marek, was 16, and every passing season brought the dread of the enlistment officer's knock closer. Jan looked out his tiny, frost-rimmed window at the barren fields. The life he lived was not a life built, but a life endured. He had inherited his father's hammer and anvil, but he would not, could not, allow Marek to inherit the family's slow, certain doom. The old world was beautiful, but it was suffocating. The evening meal was a sparse affair, thin potato soup and black bread. Jan sat with his wife, Alara, a woman whose beauty had been weathered into resilience, and Marek, whose quiet eyes held a deep, unspent energy. The silence was thick, not of contentment, but of shared, unspoken desperation. Alara finally broke it, her voice a low murmur. "The officer was in the village today, Jan. He asked after Marek." Jan's calloused hand trembled on the wooden table. "Did you tell him of the bad leg from the accident?" Alara nodded wearily. He simply smiled and said, "The Tsar is not particular about which leg a boy stands on to hold a rifle." In that moment, the future was laid bare. Either surrender their son to the military machine, or leave everything they knew. There was no third path in Dubrovka. The idea of escape was not born of courage, but of necessity. Yet it was ignited by a reckless spark of hope. The spark's name was Stefan, a distant cousin who had left 3 years prior. One frigid afternoon, a letter arrived, the paper thin and the ink smudged, but the words were golden. Here, they ask only for a strong back and a willing heart. Land is cheap. There is work in the steel mills of Pittsburgh. Come to America. Stefan included a crudely drawn map showing a land so vast it seemed mythical. America. The foreign word tasted strange on Jan's tongue. It was a place where kings held no sway, and a man's labor earned him his due. It was a dizzying, terrifying proposition, but the alternative was a certain, slow surrender. The preparations had to be made in absolute secrecy. The village was full of eyes and ears loyal to the crown, and any attempt to flee would result in swift, brutal punishment. Jan and Alara met in their small attic, beneath the heavy, gabled roof that had sheltered generations of Kowalskis. By the light of a single tallow candle, they emptied the savings they had kept in a hollowed-out book, a few worn gold coins. Alara had sold her wedding locket to the traveling peddler for extra passage money. "We tell no one," Jan whispered, gripping her hands. "Not Father Grigori, not your sister. Until the wagon is outside the door, we are simply preparing for the spring fair." They exchanged a solemn vow, a pact sealed not with a blessing, but with a fearful, desperate love for their son. The most painful part was not the journey's fear, but the last farewell. Jan sold his blacksmith shop, the source of his pride and identity, for a pittance to a rival he detested. He sold his small patch of earth, the fertile soil that had fed his family. On their final night, Alara walked to the edge of the woods and silently buried a small carved wooden horse, Marek's favorite childhood toy, a piece of the old life they could not take, but would not forget. Marek, sensing the profound loss, stood with his father by the empty forge, watching the smoke curl from a neighboring chimney. "Will it truly be better, Father?" he asked, his voice cracking. "We will be free, son," Jan replied, clutching the worn leather bag containing their papers. "That, at least, must be better." The train ride to the German port was a blur of fear and discomfort, but nothing prepared them for the stench and darkness of the steerage ship's hold. They were packed in like cargo, hundreds of souls from a dozen nations, all strangers bound by a common, desperate goal. Jan, Ilara, and Marek shared a narrow, damp bunk. The air was thick with the reek of unwashed bodies, stale food, and seasickness. The constant creaking of the hull was their lullaby. Marek lay awake, listening to the coughing of the man next to them, the crying of a child, and the low, guttural prayer of a woman across the aisle. This crowded world was a prison, yet it was the only road to freedom. 3 weeks into the voyage, the ocean reminded them of its ancient, unforgiving fury. A great tempest struck, tossing the ship like a toy. Below deck, the darkness was absolute, punctuated by the shrieks of the terrified and the crash of shifting baggage. Water leaked through the ceiling, soaking their meager bedding. Ilara huddled against Jan, murmuring prayers to a god she was suddenly unsure could hear her over the roar. Jan, terrified himself, held his family tight, his mind racing. He had faced down angry bulls and roaring fires, but this was a power he could not fight, only endure. In the terror, Marek finally spoke, not of fear, but of a strange sense of surrender. "If we die now, Father, at least we died free." Out of the trauma of the storm, a new reality began to emerge. The immigrants, who had been suspicious strangers, began to recognize their shared plight. Jan found himself sharing a piece of salted meat with an Irish laborer named Liam, and fixing the broken spectacles of a quiet Jewish scholar. Ilara traded a small, dried herb for a German woman's knitted shawl for Marek. They were forged in salt spray and fear, a nascent American community on the water. They argued over politics, taught each other simple phrases, and shared their dreams of tiny farms, of open schools, of a quiet life without fear. For the first time, Jan felt less alone. Not everyone survived. The old scholar, whom Jan had befriended, succumbed to the fever. The captain held a brief, grim ceremony on the deck. The scholar's body, wrapped in a linen shroud, was lowered into the Atlantic. Jan stood by the railing, watching the gray, churning water swallow the form. He lit a tiny, concealed lantern, a pocket-sized piece of home, and held it up, a silent prayer for the lost soul. It was a sobering moment, a reminder of the loss inherent in this journey. For every life that found a future, there was one that only found an end. Jan realized that a piece of the old world was sinking into the ocean with every burial, making the commitment to the new world all the more absolute. Then came the morning that stopped all conversation. A low roar began on the deck above, a sound that quickly turned into a joyful clamor. Marek woke Jan and Ilara, pulling them toward the hatch. On the horizon, through the morning fog, a faint, dark silhouette appeared. It was the coast of Long Island. As the ship drew closer, the statue appeared, the enormous woman holding her torch aloft. It was more majestic than any illustration they had ever seen, a giant, silent promise against the morning sky. Tears streamed down Ilara's cheeks. Jan simply...
Liam felt a strange sense of loss, a melancholy for the grand, raw challenge that had once given their lives such absolute meaning. The frontier's retreat marked not just a geographical change, but the closing of the most vital chapter of their lives. The only echoes of the gunfire that remained were in the distant rhythmic chuffing of the steam train. The railway, once the source of contention and the target of the siege, was now the lifeblood of the town, bringing commerce and connection. The iron tracks represented the triumph of order over chaos, of the collective will over individual greed. For Liam, the sound of the train was the true anthem of the peace, the final mechanical assurance that the violence was over. Finn O'Malley, the man of two worlds, carried the heaviest burden, the inheritance of management. As the patriarch and chief civic leader, he oversaw the bank, the cooperative, and the political well-being of the entire county. His struggles were not with outlaws, but with interest rates, legislation, and bureaucracy, the civilized equivalents of the range war. He had traded the rifle for the ledger, but the vigilance remained. Liam watched his son and knew that the hard-won peace was not a gift, but a perpetual responsibility. Aina's triumph was the cultural clearing of the settlement. As the town's principal historian and teacher, she ensured that the children understood that their prosperity was built on moral, not just material foundations. She taught the virtues of covenant, law, and shared sacrifice, directly combating the individualistic, materialistic impulses of the new era. Her classrooms were the true battlegrounds of the next generation, where the lessons of the past were preserved and transmitted. Liam watched his grandchildren and saw the full flower of their struggle. They possessed a freedom he and Moira could barely have imagined, the right to choose their own paths, unburdened by debt, famine, or threat. Young Molly, the scholar, was now a state senator, fighting for land reform and justice in the capital. Young Liam Jr. was designing modern housing for the town's new families. Their lives were defined by possibilities, not by immediate crushing needs. This freedom, paid for with the founder's sweat and blood, was the deepest meaning of the hard-won peace. In their later years, Liam and Moira formed a quiet reconciliation with the symbols of the state. They had watched the local sheriff's department evolve from the corrupt political tool of the cattle barons into a genuine force for communal protection. They realized that trusting the blue uniform was essential to the peace. The rule of law, once viewed with suspicion, was the ultimate framework that allowed them to finally lay down their own weapons and rest. Liam imparted his final lesson not through war stories, but through the courage in the quiet. He told his great-grandchildren, it took bravery to fight the bandit, but it took a deeper, harder courage to forgive the neighbor who wronged you, to pay the taxman honestly, and to stay here and work when it would have been easier to leave. Peace is not given when the guns stop. It is built every morning when you choose honesty over greed. This quiet, moral courage was the new foundation of their American life. Every autumn, the extended O'Malley-Jensen family gathered for the last harvest celebration. The table was impossibly long, laden with the fruits of the land. Liam and Moira would watch the generations, the children, the grandchildren, the great-grandchildren, a vast testament to their singular act of faith decades ago. There was a simple, profound gratitude and fullness in the room that transcended wealth. This was the true, tangible reward of the hard-won peace, the ability to gather without fear. The memorial stone in the town square, honoring Anders and the other fallen, remained the most important piece of town architecture. It was a visible reminder of the unforgettable cost. The town never celebrated the violence. It honored the sacrifice. The setting sun often cast long, deep shadows over the stone, a metaphor for the way the darkness of the past would always shadow their prosperity. The peace was never cheap. Its price was always visible. One winter, Moira passed away, peacefully in her sleep. Liam found her knitting needles resting beside her chair, working on a beautiful, unfinished shawl. Her final gift was the knowledge that life was a continuous creative process, and that the work was never truly finished. It was simply passed on. The shawl, like the civilization they had built, was a fabric of sacrifice and love, meant to be worn by the future. A year later, Liam O'Malley took his own last look at the setting sun from his porch. He didn't see the terror of the old frontier. He saw the beautiful, orderly world that he and Moira had forged. He felt the peace in the heart, the deep, final acceptance that the battle was over, the debt was paid, and the dream was secured. He had traded fear for courage, chaos for law, and poverty for purpose. Liam O'Malley's death was the setting sun on the frontier. It marked the final closure of an era, the passing of the founding generation whose lives were defined by the raw struggle for existence. His enduring legacy was the town of New Hope itself, a beacon of order and justice on the prairie. The hard-won peace was not the absence of trouble, but the capacity to meet that struggle with unity, law, and moral courage. The frontier was gone, but the spirit that conquered it lived on in the generations that followed.
Liam Jr., as bank manager, holds a unique and uncomfortable relic, the small bag of trapper's gold that Finn had used years ago to secure the town's first legal counsel. The gold is displayed in the bank's vault, a historical footnote. It represents the burden of wealth, the necessary cynical capital that secured their peace. Liam Jr. knows that prosperity, not poverty, is his generation's true test. The relic in the bank forces him to ask, has the quest for material stability obscured the moral vision his grandfather fought for? At the university, Molly Jensen begins her thesis, The Ethics of Settler Violence in the Nebraska Range Wars. She pores over old accounts, legal papers, and her grandfather Finn's magistrate notes. She struggles with the raw, brutal truth. The founders, while heroes, committed necessary acts of violence. Her research is a deliberate attempt to reinterpret the frontier, to move past the simple, clean stories of courage and grapple with the ambiguity of self-defense, land acquisition, and the expulsion of the indigenous population. Her intellectual honesty threatens the comfortable heroism of the town's established narrative. Molly writes a long, searching letter to the grandfather, Liam Sr., asking the core question that defines her generation. Dad, did we truly win freedom, or did we just trade one form of violence for another? Liam, sensing the deep truth of her struggle, writes back simply, "We won the right to ask the question, Molly. That is the price of peace and the work of your generation. We only had the time to fight. You have the time to judge." The family faces a modern echo of the betrayal that once threatened the grain elevator. A well-dressed urban investor attempts to buy a majority share of the cooperative bank, planning to use his control to raise interest rates and squeeze the smaller farmers. This is the ghost of Elias Thorne, the same cynical greed, but using legal documents instead of a secret tunnel. Liam Jr. uses his grandfather's hard-won lessons in finance and loyalty, leading a successful, coordinated effort by the community to block the takeover. He defeats the modern betrayal not with a rifle, but with a ledger, proving his generation's capacity for vigilance. New Hope organizes a centennial celebration, a massive town-wide event to dedicate a statue of the founding families in the town square. It is a moment of profound reflection, honoring the founders while celebrating the town's prosperity. Molly, home from the university, is asked to give the main address. She speaks not of the victory over the outlaws, but of the covenant of community, the original quiet vow of trust that preceded the walls and the laws. Her speech links the past to the new horizon, focusing on responsibility, education, and ethical stewardship.
During the celebration, Liam Jr. makes his promise to the town. He unveils plans for a massive expansion of the electric grid and a filtration system for clean water for every farm. He commits the cooperative's profits to this infrastructure, ensuring that the essential elements his grandparents fought and bled for, light, warmth, and safe water, are available to all, regardless of wealth. His vision fulfills the settlers' material dream, using modern technology to secure the communal health and well-being. Old Liam O'Malley, frail but alert, attends the ceremony, witnessing the final triumph. He sees his grandson securing the future with engineering and finance, and his granddaughter securing the soul with history and truth. He sees the culmination of the journey. The axe, the symbol of survival, has given way to the pen, the symbol of law, learning, and governance. The physical clearing of the land is complete. The moral, cultural clearing is the ongoing work of the next generation. After graduation, Molly surprises her family. She decides against the eastern cities. She chooses to return to New Hope, accepting a position teaching history at the high school, using her advanced education to deepen the community's understanding of its own past. Molly's return is the ultimate homecoming, a realization that the intellectual frontier she sought was not a place to be found, but a foundation to be built within the place her family had established. The freedom her grandparents sought was the freedom to choose to be here. The echoes of the past, the courage, the loyalty, the scars, have settled into the strong, quiet horizon of the next generation. The O'Malley family and the town of New Hope are not defined by the battles they won, but by the civil, moral society they managed to build from the ashes of conflict. The enduring dream is not the wealth, but the enduring spirit of community, justice, and self-governance. The great Nebraska experiment, begun with a single axe fall, has finally succeeded, securing a future that is both prosperous and, at last, truly peaceful.
The new allegiance to the state was complete. The young people only knew the flag and the state capital. They were Americans, rooted not in the memory of a foreign homeland, but in the specific, violent, and ultimately rewarding history of Nebraska. Yet Finn and Aine ensured that the soul of the community, the commitment to shared responsibility and internal justice, remained fiercely local. They honored the law, but they prioritized the neighbor. They had achieved a healthy balance, patriotic citizens who maintained their self-determination. Finn, recalling the wisdom of the trapper, made one final significant act of stewardship. He used his influence to establish a tract of distant land too rugged for farming as the Preserve, a permanent, protected area where the wild prairie grasses and native animals could remain untouched. This was the return of the wild, a philosophical acknowledgement that the untamed spirit that had saved them during the long winter must be protected, not conquered. The preserved land was a final, enduring nod to Silas Kane and the ethical weight of their past. The final defining moment of the saga was the wedding of Liam Jr. and the daughter of Lars Jensen. It was a massive, joyous affair that included neighbors from hundreds of miles away. The celebration was a vibrant display of the future, a joining of the two founding families symbolizing the complete integration of the community. Liam and Moira watched the young couple, realizing the greatest achievement was not the land they cleared, but the foundation of love and partnership that had emerged from the ashes of fear. Liam O'Malley's favorite time was when his grandchildren would gather around his knee asking the same question. "Grandpa Liam, tell us about the first axe fall." Liam would recount the tale of courage, not the battles or the hardships, but the simple, profound act of taking a piece of empty earth and declaring, "We will build a home here." He never focused on the blood, but on the faith. He taught them that the dream was not given, but created. Liam finally understood the enduring meaning of the dream. The true foundation of their success was not sod, or timber, or even statehood. It was shared will, the unified moral decision by a group of diverse, struggling immigrants to trust one another, to honor their commitments, and to fight for the right to govern themselves justly. The community's success was proof that a good, moral society could be built, even in the face of the harshest odds. The rebuilding of the dream was complete. It was a legacy of peace, not the peace of isolation, but the deep, satisfying peace of a well-ordered life. They had paid the cost of victory in full, and the reward was a thriving, stable society. The O'Malley family, once fleeing poverty and oppression, had found their final, permanent identity as founders of an American town. On his final evening, Liam O'Malley stood on his porch, holding Moira's hand. He looked across the vast cultivated fields toward the distant Stone Creek Bridge, now glittering with electric lamps, a clear sign of the civilization they had built. This was the promised land achieved, not a heaven, but a hard-earned, imperfect, and beautiful home. He closed his eyes, hearing the distant, comforting rumble of a train, a sound of progress, security, and a future built on new foundations. His work was done. The year is 1910. New Hope is no longer a small, ambitious settlement, but a thriving, established county seat. Brick buildings line Main Street, telephone wires hum with distant conversations, and the automobile is beginning to replace the horse-drawn wagon. This thriving stability is the direct legacy town of Liam and Moira O'Malley's struggle. The quiet, relentless work of the founders has yielded a successful, modern community. The violence of the past, the range wars, the siege, are now echoes of the past, fading into local lore, taught to children as heroic stories rather than living memories. The focus now rests on Liam and Moira's grandchildren, the true inheritors of the Scar dream. There is young Liam O'Malley Jr., Finn's son, a meticulous engineer who manages the massive grain and power cooperative. He is practical and forward-looking, embodying the technical prowess that secured the new foundation. And there is Moira Molly Jensen, Aeen's daughter, a brilliant young woman who has earned the scholarship to the State University, carrying the intellectual torch. They are the next generation's horizon, beneficiaries of a peace they did not fight for, yet bound by a history they must interpret. Old Liam O'Malley, now frail and entirely retired, spends his days on the grandfather's bench, on the porch, often joined by his great-grandchildren. He is the last of the original founders, the memory keeper. He tells the children not of the glory of the fight, but of the fear of the first snow, the taste of the meager bread, and the heavy weight of the axe. He tries to convey the profound existential reality of the frontier, knowing that in their world of trains and electricity, his stories sound like fables. Molly Jensen faces a profound dilemma unknown to her grandparents, the choice between staying and leaving. Her scholarship offers her the call of the world, a life of intellectual exploration in the eastern cities, far from the Nebraska soil. She loves New Hope and her family's legacy, yet she feels a strong pull away from the sameness of the plains. She sees the frontier not as a place to be settled, but as a place to be escaped. Her grandmother, Moira, encourages her, recognizing that true freedom means choosing one's own path, even if it leads away from the homestead. Liam Jr., conversely, is deeply rooted. His passion is the physical structure of the town. He studies the stress lines on the Stone Creek Bridge, the output of the town's first electric generator, and the complex logistics of the grain market. His sense of duty is fixed on engineering the future, ensuring the foundations laid by his grandfather remain sturdy and modern. For him, the echoes of the past are a mandate for perfection. He cannot allow a modern siege of Stone Creek to happen due to shoddy construction or careless management. One cool autumn evening, Liam Jr. and Molly meet at the old wellhead, the site of Anders's death and the settlement's most sacred ground. Liam Jr. wants to build a proper, powerful water pump station here. Molly argues that the location must remain a simple memorial. Their disagreement becomes a dialogue with the past. Liam Jr. sees the site as a symbol of survival's progress, water and power. Molly sees it as a symbol of sacrifice's purity, unmarred memory. They realize the challenge for their generation is not fighting, but integrating the practical needs of the present with the moral demands of their history.
A full decade had passed since the siege of Stone Creek. The settlement of New Hope was a frontier no more. It was a respectable town, boasting a proper brick bank, a weekly newspaper, and a church with a towering spire. The hard-won peace was now the accepted reality. The old, anxious vigilance that defined the settlers' early years had softened into the quiet confidence of a people whose place was secured by law and effort. The land was entirely claimed, surveyed, and cultivated. The last of the wild, untamed interior had receded into history and memory. Liam and Moira O'Malley lived a life of deserved retirement. Liam, hale at 70, spent his days mending small tools, tending a large vegetable garden that was purely for pleasure, and sitting on the porch with Lars Jensen, whose laughter had finally returned. Moira managed the household, hosting the Women's Council and acting as the town's living historian. They were the retirees, the original founders, who watched their dream mature from a frantic struggle into a sustainable reality. The greatest joy was the quiet sun on their faces, earned by years of relentless toil. Finn O'Malley had inherited the leadership role, transforming it from a mantle of crisis into one of civil responsibility. He had served 2 terms as the state representative and now owned the largest mercantile and the town bank, the very institutions Elias Thorne had once tried to weaponize. He was no longer just the magistrate. He was a pillar of the community, known for his fairness and his commitment to infrastructure. Finn's legacy was the embodiment of the successful settler, a man who took the lessons of the wild and applied them to building the foundations of a moral, structured society. Aine O'Malley, who had rebelled against the rifle, found her purpose in education. She was the founding teacher of the new brick schoolhouse, a permanent structure built on the site of the original sod one. She taught not just reading and numbers, but the old stories of the settlement, the first axe fall, the long winter, and the price paid at Stone Creek. Aine's path was to preserve the community's moral history, ensuring the children understood that the order and prosperity they enjoyed were purchased through the courage and sacrifice of their parents. Despite the outward success, a subtle question persisted, one that often surfaced during late-night talks between Liam and Moira. What was achieved? Had they simply exchanged the crown's tyranny for the tyranny of the state, debt, and constant work? They had lost friends and family members, and their children carried the scars of violence. The question of the dream was no longer about survival, but about meaning. Was the new foundation truly superior to the old, independent, wild dream of their youth? The new generation, Finn's son Liam Jr. and Aine's young students, took the land for granted. They knew of the Range War and the blizzards only through stories.
They saw the fields not as a challenge, but as a reliable source of income. The inheritance of hard work was simple. They had been handed a functioning, stable world. Their challenge was not to survive, but to innovate. The children's soil demanded better farming techniques, new crops, and deeper integration into the national market. The burden of survival had been replaced by the pursuit of success. The town's transformation was most evident in its architecture of permanence. The old timber and sod structures were gone, replaced by buildings of stone and glass. The old soddy was gone, but Moira had preserved its memory by building a small, beautiful stone fireplace in her parlor, using the original cornerstones of the sod house. Every brick laid, every pane of glass set, was a statement that they were here to stay. The town was no longer temporary, it was designed for centuries. Liam's old, heavy axe, which he had finally lain down after the siege, became a symbol recontextualized. Finn had it polished and hung in the central hall of the new town library, a gift to the community. It was not displayed as a tool of violence, but as a representation of labor and creation. The legacy of the axe was transformed from an image of brute force into an emblem of the dignity of work, honoring the first act of building that had begun their entire journey.
The first step in healing was the hard work of forgetting. Liam led the effort to tear down the barricades at Stone Creek, deliberately scattering the heavy ballast stones and filling in the rifle pits. The physical act of restoration was a psychological balm. They rebuilt the damaged sections of the elevator, not just for function, but as a ritualistic rejection of the chaos. Yet every rebuilt fence and every fresh coat of paint was an effort to hide the truth. They were building a new facade of normalcy, but the foundation was still soaked in fear and memory. Moira O'Malley, the true emotional anchor of the family, recognized that the home front needed healing more than the rail line. She instituted a new kind of discipline in the house. No talk of the siege, mandatory family meals with shared light stories, and a return to the simple, comforting rituals of their Irish past. She began to volunteer her time helping the widows of the fallen, not with money, but with the steady, quiet presence of a woman who had known loss and endured. Moira's counsel was clear. The ultimate act of courage was the ability to lay down the emotional burden and choose life, not war. The men, unable to speak of the violence to their wives or children, found refuge in the Veterans Club, an informal, unspoken gathering near the wellhead, Andrus's memorial. There, they could share the shared scar of the fighting in silence or with brief, knowing nods. Lars Jensen, the usually taciturn farmer, would simply sit and smoke with Liam, the mutual understanding requiring no words. This small, protected space became essential. It was a recognition that trauma was the final, unchangeable element of their American experience, and it could only be managed through a brotherhood of suffering. The deepest impact was on the younger generation. Annie O'Malley, now a thoughtful young woman, was the first to openly confront the family's violence. She refused to use the new double-barrel shotgun Finn had given her, refusing to learn to shoot, despite the continued risks. Annie's refusal was a quiet crisis of the young, a moral strike against the culture of the gun that had defined her family's survival. She told Liam she would rely on the rule of law, not the rifle. Her quiet defiance was a challenge to Liam's entire life philosophy, forcing him to acknowledge that the next generation might have to fight for peace in a radically different way. To cover the long-term medical costs for the wounded settlers and to secure permanent legal counsel for the town, Liam and Finn made a joint decision. They would sell the small stash of trapper's gold Finn had earned and kept as his symbol of frontier independence. The price of the past was the ultimate surrender of the wild dream. The gold, meant to represent freedom from markets and taxes, was now used to fund the very systems of civilized life. It was a profound symbol that the self-sufficient frontiersman was dead. The citizen had finally taken his place. Finn, using the gold to secure the best legal defense, ensured that the captured raiders received a fair, formal final verdict from the circuit court. His decision to pursue legal, not vigilante justice sent a powerful message. The era of the gun was over. The magistrate's justice became the definitive legend of the region, the ultimate statement that the rule of law was worth more than a quick, violent resolution. Finn's reputation soared. He had not just beaten the outlaws, he had transcended them. The community came together to build a proper, permanent monument to the unseen, a simple tall granite obelisk erected at the center of the town, inscribed with the names of all the settlers who had died defending the territory, from the Range War to the siege. It was a testament to Andrus's legacy and the others who paid the ultimate price. The monument was not a celebration of war, but a permanent, sober reminder of the cost of peace. It was a promise to the next generation that they would never forget how their freedom was purchased. Liam O'Malley, finally feeling the work was done, officially passed the stewardship of the farm to Finn. Liam's retirement was quiet and deserved. He took the heavy steel axe, the very tool that had been his first declaration of intent on the prairie, and after sharpening it one last time, he placed it carefully on the hooks above the stone hearth. The axe, as laid down, became his final symbolic act. The era of clearing the physical land was over. The time for building the moral and social land had begun. 10 years after the siege, New Hope was a thriving, bustling small city, completely integrated into the state. Liam stood on his porch watching Ain teach a class of children beneath the great American flag that snapped in the wind. He looked out over the perfectly divided, well-tended fields and finally understood the American dream realized. It was not the isolated wealth he once sought, but the hard-won security of a community willing to fight, legislate, and sacrifice for the right to govern itself. Liam took Moira's hand. The true cost of their victory, the blood, the guilt, the lost innocence, would never be repaid. The aftermath and ashes of their struggles were a permanent part of their souls. But as he looked at his children, thriving in the world they had fought for, he felt a final, profound stillness. They had won the great crucible of courage. The peace in the heart was not the absence of memory, but the acceptance that the fight was over and the future was safe. The work of survival was done. The work of living had finally begun.
The raiders' command, frustrated by the defense, turned to their ultimate weapon, the explosives. Finn's scouts saw a detachment carrying heavy crates and heading for the thick, central stone supports of the bridge. This became the explosives threat, a devastating danger that required immediate action. Liam had anticipated this, knowing the enemy would eventually seek to collapse the structure. He ordered a small, crucial team, including the recovered Lars Jensen, to leave their barricades and race to the supports, knowing a single well-placed charge could destroy their future. The race was won by a hair. Finn himself cornered the lead bomber on the slippery cold pier beneath the bridge. This was Finn's defining fight, a brutal close-quarters duel fought with knife and pistol against a man fighting for the nihilistic pleasure of destruction. Finn, drawing on the cold, hard lessons of the trapper's trail, fought with a calculated focus. He defeated the bomber, securing the explosives, but was left with a deep knife wound to his arm. He had saved the Stone Creek artery, securing the settlement's economic future at the cost of his own blood. As the sun rose, the raiders launched a final desperate frontal charge. The settlers were exhausted, low on ammunition, and facing certain defeat. Then, an unlikely surprise reinforcement arrived. The small garrison of state cavalry, delayed by bureaucracy, but alerted by a desperate rider sent days earlier, crested the ridge. Seeing the blue uniforms and hearing the bugle call, the raiders broke rank instantly. The turning tide was not a miracle, but the slow, inevitable reach of the law. Liam watched the state soldiers pursue the scattering outlaws, realizing that their final allegiance to the state had now paid its ultimate dividend. The siege was lifted. New Hope had held. The reckoning was quiet, somber, and profound. 2 settlers were gravely wounded, and the damage to the infrastructure was substantial. But the bridge stood. The community gathered, tending to their wounded and counting their losses. The price of citizenship, Liam realized, was not just taxes and compliance, but this profound willingness to fight and bleed for the collective structure that protected them. They had defended the law when the law itself was absent. Finn, his arm bandaged, presided over the final disposition of the captured raiders. His judgment was fair and legal, drawing a sharp, clean line between frontier justice and the rule of law.
He did not permit a vigilante hanging. He turned the raiders over to the arriving state marshal, the new magistrate. The boy who once raised a shotgun in defiance now embodied the very system he had fought to establish. He demonstrated that the ultimate crucible of courage was not just in fighting, but in restraint. The siege of Stone Creek became the definitive legend of the region. It marked the definitive birth of order on the plains, the end of the era where brute force ruled. Liam O'Malley stood on the bridge, watching a train rumble safely across the creek, a sound of progress, not war. He looked at the vast, growing town of New Hope below. They had not just homesteaded a piece of land, they had founded a civilization. The legacy of the Stone Creek was the quiet, powerful truth that on the American frontier, courage was the mortar that bound the stones of order. The days following the siege of Stone Creek were marked by a profound, unnerving quiet. The roar of the conflict had been replaced by a hushed clearing, a silence so complete it felt like a presence itself. The damage was visible: scorched earth near the rail line, bullet holes peppering the grain elevator, and the fresh graves of 3 settlers who had died defending the bridge. Yet the deepest wounds were unseen. The absence of battle was not peace, it was merely a pause, leaving the survivors trapped in the echo of the gunfire. They had secured their land and their system, but the aftermath was heavy with unaddressed trauma. Liam O'Malley found himself moving through his daily chores with a sense of immense, paralyzing fatigue. The weight of the living pressed down on him more heavily than the work of the dead. He and Moira spoke little, their communication reduced to necessary logistics and worried glances. He noticed the way Lars Jensen now started violently at sudden noises, and how Finn, his arm still bandaged, slept with his loaded pistol under his pillow. The unspoken toll of the range war and the siege was a shared, corrosive reality. They were all veterans now, and the skills that had saved them, the vigilance, the readiness for violence, were now preventing them from finding rest. During the siege, Liam had given the order to fire the final devastating volley that broke the raiders' line. Now, in the aftermath and ashes, the memory of that command left behind ethical embers that burned with persistent guilt. He had killed men, not in personal self-defense, but in a calculated act of war for the good of the state. He found himself questioning the moral high ground they had fought for. Had they become the very instruments of violence they had fled from in the old world? Was the difference between a defender and an executioner merely a matter of whose side the law favored? This guilt of the defender was the sharpest cost of their victory. Finn O'Malley, the new magistrate, faced the contradiction most acutely. He had to dispense justice, the very thing they had fought to establish, to the captured raiders. Sitting in the makeshift courthouse, wearing his clean, civilized clothes, he felt the cold, familiar steel of his pistol pressed against his thigh. He was asked to judge men who had used the very violence he himself had mastered. Finn's burden was the hypocrisy of the magistrate and the gun. He was the embodiment of the law, but his authority was rooted in the deadly knowledge of the frontier. He longed for the simple, clear ethics of the trapper's trail, where the law was only hunger and cold. The funeral for the fallen settlers was a quiet, solemn affair. As the dirt was shoveled onto the simple wooden coffins, Liam felt he was burying more than just his neighbors. He was burying the ashes of the past, the remnants of the old, naive dream of a peaceful, isolated republic. The cost of victory had been the final, definitive realization that independence was an illusion. Their survival was owed to the state, to the rail line, and to the organized, terrible power of their own collective violence. The old loyalties to the small, self-sufficient circle were gone. replaced by the bitter, broader duties of citizenship.
10 years after the first sod house was built, the Stone Creek Valley was no longer just a border. It was the artery of the new state. The single, largest piece of infrastructure connecting the burgeoning eastern cities to the western plains ran right through it. A massive new Stone Creek Bridge carrying the main rail line and a vital wagon road. This junction point was the economic heart of the entire region, and the small town of New Hope had grown into a respectable supply depot because of it. Finn O'Malley, now a respected local magistrate and the owner of the largest grain depot, had fought for years to secure this location. The hard-won prosperity of the community made it a glaring, irresistible target. The statehood and the rail line had defeated the major cattle syndicates, but they had left behind a bitter, violent residue. Small, organized gangs of dispossessed ranch hands, outlaws, and those who simply hated the rule of law. These remnants, loosely affiliated and known collectively as the Free Raiders, saw the Stone Creek Bridge not as progress, but as a symbolic structure to be destroyed. Its collapse would plunge the region back into chaos, allowing them to loot the chaos and prove that the true frontier still belonged to the gun. Finn O'Malley, now a respected local magistrate and the owner of the largest grain depot, had fought for years to secure this location. Finn O'Malley, still the community's keenest observer, received the first warning. A former associate of the disgraced trapper Silas Kane arrived at Finn's depot with a nervous message. The Free Raiders were mobilizing in the distant hills, planning a coordinated, massive attack to destroy the bridge and sever the state. The scout's warning was stark. The Raiders were not just petty thieves. They were organized and armed with stolen military explosives. Finn knew the new state government, preoccupied with bureaucracy, was too slow to react. New hope was on its own. Liam O'Malley, now a man of 60, found himself once again standing before the community, his voice ringing with the hard-earned authority of a founder. The call to defend Stone Creek was clear. The bridge was not the government's property, it was their future. To lose it would be to surrender the decade of sacrifice, from the axe fall to the bloodshed at the well. The conflict was no longer a personal land dispute. It was the ultimate citizen's duty to defend the hard-won structures of their society. Every able-bodied man and woman gathered at the supply depot, ready to transition from civil life to siege. The stage was set for the siege of Stone Creek, a confrontation that would serve as the crucible of courage. This was the settlers' final, absolute test, a true measure of whether they had merely survived or whether they had become a cohesive, unified civilization capable of defending its achievements. The fight would not be against nature or a single corrupt neighbor, but against the forces of anarchy itself. Every lesson learned, from the vigilance of the long winter to the unity of the range war, would be poured into this final defense. Liam O'Malley, recognized by all as the master of defense, took command. His strategy was simple and reflected the core values of their settlement: use local knowledge, prioritize the infrastructure, and fight as a single unit. He organized the community into 3 tiers: Finn and a team of sharpshooters on the high ridges overlooking the bridge, Lars Jensen and the older men defending the bridge approaches with prepared barricades, and Moira, led by the women, running the ammunition and medical depot from the protected cellar of the grain elevator. The founder's authority was absolute and respected. Finn, with his trapper's discipline, led the most critical unit, the bridge's guard. They dug in on the steep banks, using the railroad's own ballast stones to create formidable barricades. Finn's tactical mind was sharp. He didn't wait for the enemy to arrive, but sent out patrols to harass their supply lines, slowing their advance and confusing their scouting efforts. He had learned from the range war that aggression and foresight were the only true defense. His command held the key to the entire operation. If the bridge was taken, the battle was lost. The Free Raiders struck at midnight, launching the first wave with a coordinated assault on the wagon road. They were a force of about 30 hard-riding men who expected a small, frightened militia. They met Lars Jensen and a group of grim, prepared veterans whose rifles were steady and their aim true. The fight was furious and short. Lars's men held, but they were exhausted, and one settler was seriously wounded. The raiders, surprised by the stiff, organized resistance, retreated under heavy fire, leaving several horses and a clear message. This was a sustained, desperate siege, not a simple raid. The true test of the settlement's nerve came hours later, when the raiders, learning of the civilian logistics, targeted Moira's depot. They concentrated heavy fire on the grain elevator, hoping to collapse the supply chain and terrify the women. Moira's courage was on full display.
With the sound of bullets echoing in the vast hollow elevator, she directed the women, ensuring the wounded were tended and the ammunition was packed and sent to the firing lines. She organized the fire brigade, constantly dousing the timber walls to prevent the kerosene-soaked rags from igniting. The depot under fire remained operational, a clear signal to the raiders that New Hope's will would not break.
The community, seeing the moral dilemma, rallied behind a third option, Finn's candidacy. Finn, the man of two worlds, was an eloquent compromise. He had the wisdom of the frontier, the scars of the range war, and the education to understand the larger political landscape. He represented the voice of the new world, a blend of the settler's grit and the citizen's duty. He ran on a single platform. We will not be the old world's crown. We will fight for our rights in the legislature as fiercely as we fought for our water at the well. Finn's election was a symbolic victory, proving the settlers could shape, not just endure, the new state. Liam found himself quietly observing the enthusiasm of his son in the community, with a deep, private sadness. He couldn't shake the old man's silence, the feeling that the fiercely independent New Hope he had sacrificed for was dying, replaced by something bureaucratic and cold. His allegiance had been to the community, to the small moral republic they had built in the clearing. The state, with its politicians and distant laws, felt like a return to the systems he had fled. He was the root, but the tree was now growing in a direction he hadn't intended. His loyalty was being left behind. The most difficult shifting allegiance came with the railroad's final victory. To secure the state capital and necessary infrastructure funds, Finn and the delegates were forced to grant significant concessions to the rail companies, the very entities that had financed the cattle barons. The tracks would now run directly across a portion of the communal land. It was a necessary evil, a political compromise that brought the market closer, but violated the sanctity of their claimed soil. Liam watched the surveyors mark the line, recognizing the truth. The small, perfect republic of New Hope could not survive without becoming imperfectly integrated into the larger, flawed nation. To ensure law and order during the transition, the state sent a small garrison, a detachment of U.S. cavalry soldiers to be quartered near the settlement. The blue uniforms were a startling sight. They represented the very government that had ignored their pleas during the range war. Yet they were also protection against future syndicate attacks. The settlers had to make a conscious effort to begin trusting the blue uniform, accepting that the ultimate defense of their land now rested not with their personal rifles, but with the organized violence of the state. This was the most profound shifting of allegiance, trading self-reliance for structured security. Finn's time at the state convention was arduous. He fought endlessly against proposals designed to favor corporate landholders and rail tycoons, advocating fiercely for protections for water rights and small farmers. He realized that the political battlefield was no less dangerous than the range war, but the weapons were words and laws. He was a voice in the capital, learning to navigate the smoke-filled rooms and compromises that defined the new American political landscape. His reports home, filled with details of legislation and lobbying, completed the settlers' transition into citizens. To fund the new local government and build the necessary roads, the community agreed to sell a portion of its collectively owned grain elevator profits. This was the community's sacrifice, the final painful recognition that the price of order was the dispersal of their independent wealth. The money was not lost to betrayal or theft, but deliberately surrendered to the abstract concept of the state. It was a trade, a piece of their financial freedom for the promise of legal protection and infrastructure. One spring morning, Liam and Finn rode out together, not to plow, but to dismantle the very first structure Liam had built, the last firebreak that had defined the border of their independent claim. Finn, with the efficiency of the trapper, tore down the thick, heavy sod walls. The act was symbolic. The end of the wild frontier was not marked by a battle, but by a decision to join the national grid. The territory no longer needed a ring of defense against the chaos. It was now surrounded by laws, districts, and fellow citizens. On the first official statehood day, the New Hope community gathered. The large American flag was raised, snapping crisply in the prairie wind. Liam stood next to Moira, watching his son, Finn, give a speech. Finn spoke not of the president or the capital, but of Anders, of the long winter, and of the power of the communal vow. He argued that the new flag's meaning was not what it represented to the government, but what it represented to them, a synthesis of struggles and a guarantee that their self-won rights would now be federally protected. Liam looked at the flag, no longer with suspicion, but with a complex sense of ownership. He had left the old world to escape its flag, but he had fought a range war and navigated betrayal to earn his place under a different flag. His final allegiance was not to the color or the state, but to the system that Finn was now working to perfect, a flawed, bureaucratic, but ultimately democratic system that allowed him, the former blacksmith, and his son, the former trapper, a voice. The O'Malley saga ended not in a final battle, but in a final understanding. The American definition of freedom was not found in independence, but in the hard, continuous work of shared governance.
The syndicate's final assault was launched against the most essential target, the well, the life source. Duke's men attacked under the cover of a freezing pre-dawn fog. This was the final stand. Liam commanded the defense from the high ground near the house, while Lars defended the well's stone wall. The fighting was close, desperate, and filled with the acrid smell of gunpowder. Liam fought with a ferocity he never knew he possessed, not for land, but for the water that had saved his family from the long winter. The settlers held the line, but at a terrible price. During the thickest part of the battle, Lars's rifle jammed. Anders, the young farmer who had insisted on returning to the fight despite his wound, rushed forward to cover him. He was struck down by 2 bullets and died instantly at the well's edge. The loss was devastating, transforming the settlers' fear into righteous fury. Lars, grabbing Anders' still warm rifle, led a desperate counterattack that drove the remaining syndicate men into a confused full retreat. The attack was repelled, and the escalation on the border was over. New Hope had won, but the victory was soaked in the blood of one of their own. The syndicate, defeated and unwilling to risk further casualties or the cost of a protracted siege, withdrew entirely, abandoning the territory. Duke sent a brief, unsigned note acknowledging their surrender of the field. However, victory brought a new challenge, the shadow of the law. The county sheriff, a political ally of the powerful cattle barons, arrived 2 days later. He did not praise the settlers' defense. He demanded that Liam and Lars account for the bodies of the syndicate men they had killed, threatening them with charges of murder and vigilantism. They had survived the gunfight only to face the legal system. Liam, drawing on the lessons learned from the betrayal of Thorn, fought back with transparency. He sent Finn to the nearest town with a written account of the syndicate's atrocities and Anders' death, demanding it be published. This was the new vigilance, using the emerging power of the media to fight the corruption of the law. The published story, detailing the greed of the Wyoming syndicate and the heroic defense of the homesteaders, galvanized public opinion across the territory. The legal pressure dissolved, and the justice for Anders was found not in the courtroom, but in the court of public opinion. The call to arms had saved the New Hope community, establishing their right to the land with permanent, painful finality. But the victory left a lasting scar. They were no longer the simple, moral farmers of their genesis. They were hardened, wary fighters. Liam buried Anders with a settler's shovel and a soldier's honor. He looked at the border, no longer a shifting line, but a defined territory earned by the spilled blood of his neighbor. The legacy of the call to arms was the truth that on the frontier, the foundation of civilization was not built just with the axe and the plow, but also with the rifle, and that survival against all odds often came at the cost of the soul's deepest peace. The victory over the cattle syndicates had been absolute,
but the cost of victory was etched into the land and the settlers' faces. The quiet scar of Anders' death lay over the New Hope community like a perpetual shadow. The wellhead where he fell was marked not by a plaque, but by a smooth white stone that Liam O'Malley had placed there, a silent reminder of the blood spilled for their water rights. The settlers had saved their land, but they had lost their innocence. They were no longer simply homesteaders. They were veterans of a small, brutal war, their hard-won peace requiring constant, wary maintenance. The men kept their weapons close, a habit born of necessity that now felt like a new kind of burden. The rifle, once a tool for hunting, was now a symbol of their political standing. The weight of the rifle represented the constant psychological tax of vigilance. Liam especially felt the shift. He had fought for a community free from the oppression of kings and barons, only to discover that freedom required its own constant, often violent, defense. He found himself looking at the horizon not for new threats, but for signs of the larger world that must inevitably claim them. That larger world arrived not with the crack of a rifle, but with a piece of official paper. In the late summer, a messenger rode in with the governor's decree. The territory, long neglected and considered merely a vast, exploitable resource, had amassed the population necessary for statehood. The entire region, including New Hope, would transition from a lawless territory under federal oversight to an organized state with senators, taxes, and formal courts. This dawn of statehood was a seismic event, demanding the settlers trade their fiercely independent communal law for the authority of a distant, anonymous capital. The decree was immediately followed by a wave of official enthusiasm. A traveling representative arrived, planting the American flag, a new, grander banner than the settlers had ever seen, in the center of their clearing, right next to the communal well. The gesture was meant to inspire, but it felt like an intrusion. The flag, representing the distant government, stood in direct symbolic competition with the simple fence post that represented their local loyalty to New Hope. The community, led by Liam, had fought to define its own borders. Now a new, competing loyalty was being demanded. The most immediate and tangible effect of statehood was the arrival of the first taxman. He was a neatly dressed bureaucrat with a cold, unforgiving ledger book, assessing property values and demanding a fixed percentage of their annual income. The settlers, who had fiercely guarded their grain from the syndicate and their accounts from Thorne, were now forced to surrender their earnings to an authority that had offered them no aid during the winter or the Range War. The price of inclusion was heavy, stirring the old, deep resentment Liam carried from the Crown's tax collectors in the Old World. The demands of statehood required political participation. An election was called to select a local delegate to the state convention. The choice was bitterly divisive. Some settlers, including the Kellys, who had finally returned, favored a candidate supported by the wealthy rail and lumber interests, hoping to gain favor. Liam and Lars, however, championed the humble circuit teacher, Mr. Davies, arguing for a delegate whose allegiance would be to the common farmer. The choice of representation forced the community to confront its new identity. Were they independent producers, or were they now part of a larger political machine?
Battered, but ultimately stronger. The failure of one man had forged a more resilient, more vigilant society. The lesson was clear. The frontier required not just courage against nature, but uncompromising honesty among men. For the New Hope community, the border was never a fixed line on a map. It was a shifting line defined by their farthest fence posts and the willingness of the next man to honor them. After the betrayal of Elias Thorne, the settlers had achieved a fragile internal peace, but the external pressures were mounting. The great cattle syndicates of the North, temporarily thwarted by Liam and Lars's resilience, were now pressing south with renewed determination, claiming the vast open prairie for their herds. The barbed wire of the few remaining hardliners became a symbol of the larger conflict, the right of the small farmer versus the greed of the ranching oligarchs. The conflict crystallized with the arrival of the ultimatum. A massive, intimidating wagon train arrived at the edge of the New Hope territory, bearing the brand of the Wyoming Cattlemen's Association, and led by a foreman named Duke, a man whose frame was as brutal as his intent. Duke rode into the settlement not seeking negotiation, but delivering a single demand. The small farmers must dismantle their fences, sell their water rights, and clear the prairie for the passage of 500,000 cattle being driven south. The cattle baron's threat was explicit. You clear the path, or we'll clear it for you. We don't negotiate with dirt farmers. The demand was a declaration of war, directly challenging the price of land Liam O'Malley had paid for years. Liam O'Malley, now the de facto leader of the settlement's defense, immediately called a council of war at the schoolhouse. The familiar room, usually filled with the sounds of children and lessons, was now a somber gathering of men with grim faces and rifles. They were simple farmers, blacksmiths and tradesmen, not soldiers. The question before them was not if they should fight, but how. Lars Jensen argued for diplomacy, suggesting they offer a paid, supervised route through the least developed land. Finn, however, stood with his trapper's shotgun. They don't want passage, father. They want the land. Diplomacy shows weakness. The vote was decisive. They would not surrender. The community made the painful, necessary transition from plowshares to rifles. The call to arms was simple and immediate. Every able-bodied man over the age of 16 was assigned a post and a duty. The women, led by Moira O'Malley and Ingrid Jensen, organized the logistics, collecting stores, molding bullets, and tending to the forge for necessary repairs. Finn, with his knowledge of tracking and the territory, was appointed chief scout, leading a small dedicated patrol to monitor the movement of the syndicate's men. Mobilizing the defense required a level of unified collective effort the settlement hadn't seen since the long winter. Yet this time, the enemy was not nature, but other men, a reality that weighed heavily on Liam. As the men drilled in the evenings, their movements clumsy but determined, Liam wrestled with the moral pivot. He had spent years building a community based on law and shared loyalty. Now he was leading them into organized, inevitable violence. He spoke to the Reverend Thorne's successor, a young nervous circuit preacher, asking for guidance. The preacher could only offer hesitant words about defending one's home. Liam realized the cost of escalation was the loss of innocence, the moment when the farmer's virtue gave way to the fighter's necessity. He looked at Finn, now hardened and purposeful, and saw a man he hadn't raised, a man of the gun. The first confrontation was swift and brutal. Duke's men, confident in their numerical superiority, attempted to breach the northernmost fence line at a river ford, the North Crossing. Finn and his scouts were waiting. The first shots were not volleys, but scattered, frantic exchanges that shattered the morning silence. A young Swedish farmer, Anders, fell grazed by a bullet. The syndicate men, surprised by the settlers' organized defense and the accuracy of Finn's rifle, retreated quickly, leaving a wounded horse behind. The skirmish was brief, but its impact was vast. Blood had been spilled on New Hope soil, and there was no going back. The syndicates, understanding the settlers' economy, immediately retaliated by targeting the grain elevator, the very symbol of collective trust that had defined their success. 2 nights later, a group of 5 raiders crept in, intending to burn the structure. Lars Jensen and 3 others who were sleeping inside to guard the stores awoke to the smell of kerosene. A desperate hand-to-hand fight erupted in the dark, dusty interior. The raiders were driven off, but the side of the elevator was scorched, and a critical pulley system was disabled. The siege made clear the syndicate strategy, not to kill, but to cripple the settlement's economic heart. The settlers responded by reinforcing the disputed fences. The remaining hardliners, including the former vigilantes who had returned under the unified call to arms, demanded that they string barbed wire hidden in the tall grass, a deadly, unforgiving trap. Liam, remembering the original fencing debate, fought the proposal, arguing it was an inhumane tactic that would cripple animals and men alike, turning the defense into an act of malice. He was voted down. The sight of the cruel new wires being strung was a sickening sign that the ethics of defense were being compromised by the terror of war. They were sinking to the level of their aggressors. Finn, meanwhile, conducted deep reconnaissance, taking his trapper's knowledge far into the enemy's camp. He discovered the true strength of the enemy. They were not just ranch hands, but hired gunmen, paid veterans of other range wars, well-armed, professional, and ruthless. He observed Duke's massive supply train and his field command. Finn returned with the grim truth. The settlers were outnumbered 3-1, and the syndicate was preparing a coordinated, massive attack intended to sweep the entire settlement clean. His report, accurate and cold, extinguished any remaining illusion of a quick, clean victory. The burden of the call to arms weighed heavily on Moira O'Malley. While the men fought on the border, she led the home front. She organized the women into a formidable force of logistics and nursing. She oversaw the rationing of medicine, the repair of clothes, and the preparation of food for the outposts. When the injured Anders was brought in, she tended his wound with the same fierce care she had given Ein during the long winter. Moira's choice was clear. If the men were to be the shield, the women would be the unshakable foundation. Their silent work was the true engine of the community's strength.
3 consecutive years of good rains had brought the season of abundance to the New Hope settlement. The fields were wide and green, the timber houses sturdy, and the collective wealth was higher than the settlers had ever dared dream. This success, however, carried an insidious risk, the bloom of false security. Prosperity had dulled the sharp, vigilant edges honed by the blizzard and the battles with the land speculators. People began to relax, to focus on comfort rather than vigilance. The unspoken vulnerability of their communal success was the assumption that the hard-won unity of the past could not be broken by anything so base as human greed. The ultimate symbol of their achievement was the grain elevator, a tall timber structure recently built near the new rail line, designed and managed by a committee of the original settlers, including Liam O'Malley and Lars Jensen. This elevator was not owned by the railroad. It was cooperatively owned by the farmers. It represented their independence, allowing them to store their grain until prices were favorable, collectively challenging the power of the large mercantile houses. The elevator committee handled all the accounts and sales, requiring collective trust, a vast reservoir of faith in the honesty of their neighbors. The critical position on the committee was the treasurer, the keeper of the ledger. This role fell to Elias Thorne, no relation to the land speculator, a meticulous, quiet man who had arrived in New Hope shortly after the long winter. Thorne was soft-spoken, deeply pious, and had a knack for numbers. He quickly gained the respect of the settlers. Liam and Lars, busy in their fields, handed him the full financial reins, trusting his piety and his skill with the ledger. His rise to this position of unquestioned authority was based entirely on the community's need for efficiency and their collective exhaustion with management. Finn O'Malley, returned from his journeys, was now the local authority on trade and routes. He noticed subtle, disquieting things. The local grain prices, reported by Thorne, often lagged suspiciously behind the Omaha market reports Finn received from the traveling traders. Furthermore, the elevator's account books, which Thorne kept hidden in a locked chest, were rarely audited. Finn tried to express his unease to his father, pointing out the disproportionate number of low-volume, high-price sales recorded. "He doesn't waste, Da," Finn argued, using the new sight gained from the trapper's discipline. "But he's not selling at the right time. He's missing the peaks." Liam, trusting the community's choice, waved off the concerns,
attributing them to his frontier warning and youthful cynicism. The first visible seed of discord came from outside the ledger. The Kellys, the former vigilantes, returned briefly to the area and, in a public display of malice, spread a rumor spark in the railhead town. They claimed Thorne was seen paying cash for a new, expensive team of horses far beyond his means. Weeks later, Thorne replaced his worn farm clothes with fine clothes, expensive wool suits, and began erecting an unusually elaborate iron-wrought new fence around his small property. The discrepancy between his humble role and his sudden visible wealth fueled the growing dust of distrust among the settlers. As the cold weather approached, the annual audit of the grain elevator's inventory and accounts was due. The farmers expected a massive payout. The yield had been excellent and prices had recently spiked. Thorne, however, presented the committee with a meticulously detailed report showing an expected deficit. He attributed the shortfall to fluctuations in the futures market, unforeseen transport fees, and minor shrinkage in the stored grain. The figures were confusingly complex, designed to baffle, not illuminate. The winter haul was supposed to be a triumph. Instead, it was a disappointment. Lars Jensen, never one for numbers but possessing a powerful moral compass, was the first to refuse the report. "I don't understand your figures, Elias, but my bin held 1,000 bushels, and I know what that is worth. Something is wrong." Lars, supported by Liam, made the audit demand. The account books and the grain stores must be publicly and immediately examined by an independent body. This put Thorne's loyalty under pressure. He reacted with righteous indignation, accusing Lars and Liam of slandering a Christian man and threatening to resign and take the community's entire financial history with him. The independent audit was delayed by Thorne's resistance. However, Finn, using his trapper skill for tracking, began inspecting the elevator's exterior. The grain was protected by thick walls, but Finn noticed a faint, unnatural pattern of tracks leading from the elevator's foundation toward Thorne's newly fortified barn. Working through the night with a few trusted neighbors, Finn dug into the earth beneath the grain tower. There, he made the devastating discovery: a secret tunnel, small but functional, leading directly from the bottom of the main grain bin where a removable plank allowed access. This was the physical betrayal, a hidden siphon used to slowly and steadily steal the farmers' collective grain. Confronted with the evidence of the tunnel, Thorne immediately confessed, but not before burning the official, falsified committee ledger. However, Finn, having suspected Thorne's duplicity earlier, had used his own meager funds to pay the town clerk for copies of the original, unedited transport receipts and sales reports. These documents, the true ledger, revealed the staggering extent of the crime. For 2 years, Thorne had been siphoning off the top-grade grain, selling it at peak prices to his own private agent in Omaha, and then using the complex fees and deficits to cover the shortfall. He had stolen enough to ruin several families. The immediate reaction was not just anger, but a corrosive dust of distrust that settled over the entire settlement. The theft was not just of grain, it was the moral fallout of a neighbor using their shared faith as a weapon. If Elias Thorne, the quiet church-going treasurer, could commit this calculated betrayal, whom could they ever trust again? The collective enterprise, the core strength of their new society, seemed to shatter. Wives questioned their husbands' judgments, and neighbors looked at each other with suspicion. The foundation of loyalty Liam had built was crumbling beneath the weight of this single devastating dishonesty. Thorne was immediately arrested and detained in the small wooden schoolhouse, the very place he had led prayer meetings. Liam, unwilling to surrender their justice to a distant, unreliable county seat, called for a trial by community. The event was held in the central clearing, with the grain elevator standing as the silent accuser. Liam acted as the prosecutor, Lars as the jury foreman, and the entire settlement served as the judgment of peers. Thorne, defiant and self-pitying, claimed the farmers' wealth had made them arrogant. The evidence, however, was overwhelming. The community found Thorne guilty.
The sentence was a profound and defining one. Not prison, which would have been an expensive burden, but exile. Thorne was stripped of his property, his fine clothes, and his horses, all of which were seized as partial restitution. He was given a mule, a sack of dried food, and a rifle, and banished with a firm warning never to return. The price of repair was not just financial, it was the public, ritualistic rejection of the kind of cynical self-interest that had almost destroyed their unity. The community had enforced its own morality. The financial reckoning was painful. After restitution, the community still faced a significant loss. However, the original settlers, Liam, Lars, and a few others, called a final meeting. They proposed a plan. Use the recovered assets to cover the immediate deficit, and each family would donate a portion of their next year's crop to cover the final shortfall. This was the renewal of the vow, a commitment to absorb the damage collectively rather than let any single family be ruined. The settlers agreed, understanding that the value of their collective trust was far higher than the loss of the grain. With Thorne gone, the community needed a new trusted treasurer. The community's choice was Finn O'Malley. Finn initially resisted, wary of the burden of trust, but Liam quietly encouraged him. Finn accepted, establishing immediate and strict transparency. Weekly reports posted publicly, monthly audits by a rotating committee of 3 women whose reputation for sharpness was unmatched, and every account book kept under public lock and key in the schoolhouse. The new keeper of the ledger would be defined by openness, not secrecy. The betrayal in the settlement left a permanent mark. The dust of distrust never truly settled. It became a part of the air they breathed, not a paralyzing fear, but a constant, healthy vigilance. The community never again operated on blind faith. They operated on systems, transparency, and a continuous check on power. Liam O'Malley stood by the reorganized grain elevator, watching Finn discuss prices openly with a group of farmers. The moral foundation of New Hope was reborn from the ashes.
The wildness and packaging it for the distant, civilized markets of the East, he realized the price of the pelt was not just in money, but in the slow, inevitable shrinking of the wilderness itself. One evening, while setting snares on a high-ground ridge overlooking a massive valley, Finn spotted a lone figure watching them, a silent, older man dressed in tattered government-issue clothes. It was an indigenous man, but not from the local tribes. Silas approached him cautiously, offering dry jerky. The man spoke in a strange, clicking tongue, pointing to a distant, smoky fire. He was a survivor of a forced relocation, searching for his family. In the man's tired eyes, Finn saw a shared loneliness, the deep existential solitude of 2 souls displaced by the forces of the frontier, one by the government, the other by a relentless ambition. Finn shared his own water and silently understood the true weight of the American journey. The long weeks of isolation honed Finn's senses and changed his core being. He was no longer the restless farm boy. He had adopted the wilderness mentality, a state of constant, quiet alertness. He learned to sleep light, to trust his instincts over his logic, and to find comfort in the wild, untamed chaos. The arbitrary rules and conflicts of New Hope, the barbed wire, the debt, and the land disputes, seemed small and silly when compared to the magnificent indifference of the mountain peaks. He realized that the greatest freedom was not in owning land, but in knowing how to survive off it, entirely beyond the civilized fence. In late October, a sudden, sharp chill swept down from the north, and the first snow fell, a clear, cold reminder that the turning point was upon them. Silas packed the last of their pelts, now a massive, rich haul. He had kept his word. Finn was strong, skilled, and ready for home. As they began the long descent from the foothills, Silas, for the first time, spoke of his own past, a brutal tale of betrayal and loss that had driven him to trade human society for the company of the wild animals. Finn listened, recognizing the deep, self-imposed isolation that was the other side of frontier independence. On the last day of the journey, as they approached the familiar settled land near New Hope, Silas handed Finn a heavy, double-barreled shotgun, an expensive piece of equipment. "The trapper's trust is earned, boy,"
not given. You've earned this and more." Silas then fulfilled the final exchange of the bargain, paying Liam not just the promised sum in prime beaver pelts, but also a small carved wooden box containing 2 gold coins, a genuine gesture of respect. Liam accepted the gold and the shotgun, his initial suspicion replaced by a grudging nod of respect for the cynical trapper. Silas turned without a goodbye, melting back into the prairie, refusing the comforts of the community he had helped protect. Re-entry into New Hope was jarring. Finn felt clumsy in his civilized clothes, the sounds of the farm animals too loud, the scent of burning wood too sweet. The familiar was made strange. He looked at his father's carefully plowed fields and saw not prosperity, but effort. He looked at the barbed wire fences and saw not protection, but foolish boundaries. His eyes, trained by the wilderness, noticed every unnecessary movement, every wasted gesture. The men of the community seemed softer, their worries smaller. Finn realized the wilderness had given him a new kind of sight. Finn took his place back in the community, but he was a changed man. He no longer saw the land as property, defined by the deed in his father's strongbox. He saw it as life, an intricate, fragile web of water, soil, and creatures. He began to apply the trapper's discipline to the farm, utilizing less, observing more, understanding the cycle of nature rather than fighting it. He taught the younger children the language of the forest and the proper way to treat a wounded animal, blending the raw knowledge of the interior with the ethical framework of the settlement. Finn O'Malley became the link between the New Hope settlement and the vast, untamed interior. He was the scout, the hunter, the one the community relied on to track lost livestock or guide new settlers safely. He was the man of 2 worlds, rooted in his father's civilized soil, but guided by the wild wisdom of the trapper. He had embarked on his journey as a restless farm boy, seeking escape. He returned as a confident frontiersman, ready to define the future of his own world. The trapper's tale had become his own legacy, proving that the greatest treasures of the interior were not gold or fur, but knowledge, self-reliance, and the humility to survive.
The spring that followed the long winter brought a profound yet uneasy renewal. While the adults focused on replanting the fields and rebuilding the fences, Finn O'Malley, now a tall, restless 16-year-old, felt a strong lure of the far horizon. He had proven his resilience in the blizzard, but the cleared land felt too small, too safe. The prairies stretched outward, beckoning with secrets and challenges the plow could not touch. Finn looked at the faint blue line of the distant hills and felt the restlessness of a son no longer content with his father's clearing. He yearned for the interior, the deep wilderness that defined the true frontier. That longing was answered by a familiar, unwelcome face. Silas Kane, the cynical, lone prospector from the Black Hills, reappeared in the clearing. He was thinner, more weathered, and now carried the distinctive, heavy pack and tools of a seasoned trapper. He had passed through the winter further north, trapping beaver and marten. His arrival was met with cautious distrust by Liam and Moira. But when Finn saw Silas's wolfskin cap and the glint of the traps in his pack, he saw not the Grady prospector, but a guide to the vast, uncharted world that lay beyond his father's fence. Silas hadn't returned for money, but for labor. His partner had perished in the winter, and he needed a strong back and a trustworthy pair of eyes for a long summer journey into the foothills, a 5-month trip targeting untouched beaver territory. He made a hard offer to Liam. Finn would serve as his apprentice to the wild, learning trapping, tracking, and survival. In return, Silas would pay Liam a substantial sum in furs and guarantee Finn's safe return before the next snowfall. Liam initially refused, citing Silas's dubious past and Finn's youth, but Finn argued his case with fierce determination, appealing to his father's own journey for freedom. "I need to learn what is beyond the fence, Da. I need to know the land, not just the soil." Moira was frantic with fear, but Liam, remembering his own youthful desperation to escape the old world, recognized the fire in his son's eyes. He saw that keeping Finn confined would be more dangerous than letting him go. He made Silas swear a solemn oath, not on a Bible, which Silas scoffed at, but on the honor of the wilderness to protect Finn. The father's reluctance was immense, a heavy, sinking feeling of failure and pride mixed together. He packed Finn's bag with extra dried meat, gave him his best hunting knife, and offered one final piece of advice. Trust your eyes, son, and the silence, and never forget the community that waits for you here. The departure was quiet, early, and emotionally difficult. Moira held Finn tight, pressing a small, worn Irish cross into his hand. Finn, dressed in leather and canvas, was transformed. As he walked away, leading a pack horse laden with traps, he turned at the edge of the firebreak, the very spot where he had made his stand against the vigilantes. He looked back at his father, his mother, and the familiar sight of the Jensen homestead smoke rising in the distance. He took a deep breath, tasted the raw, sharp scent of the untouched prairie, and then, stepping beyond the clearing, he turned his face toward the interior. The first weeks were brutal. Silas enforced the trail's discipline with cold, uncompromising efficiency. Finn learned to walk silently for hours, carrying the punishing weight of the pack. His shoulders soon rubbed raw. He learned to read the sky for weather, to identify edible plants from poisonous ones, and to make fire in the rain. Silas taught him 100 necessary skills, drilling them into Finn with stern repetition. He learned that the wilderness had no patience for mistakes. Carelessness was paid for with hunger, cold, or death. Finn's soft farm hands hardened into the rough, scarred tools of a survivor. Silas's true expertise lay in the river country. He taught Finn the language of the trap, the subtle signs of beaver work, the scratch of an otter, the scent sign of a wolf. They learned to read the river not as a line of water, but as a living ecosystem. Finn watched, mesmerized, as Silas set his traps, not with brute force, but with an almost spiritual understanding of the animal's habits. It was a precise, meticulous craft, a deadly ballet of observation and patience. Finn learned to respect the prey, recognizing the vast intelligence required to outsmart a wild animal. As the summer wore on, Finn was forced to confront the dark heart of the trapper's tale, the ethic of exploitation. The pelts they gathered were beautiful, soft, and valuable, but the process was often cruel. Silas was pragmatic. He never wasted meat or fur, believing to honor the kill was the only rule. But Finn struggled with the sight of the blood, the sudden end of a wild life. He saw the vastness of the land and the relentless mechanical nature of their work, capturing.
The small house, once a haven, became a psychological prison. The confinement weighed heavily on them all. Moira, who thrived on conversation and work, began to suffer from a crippling restlessness. Finn, smart and energetic, grew sullen, staring at the same four walls and the endless snowdrifts. The children started to bicker over trifles. Liam, exhausted by the continuous tunneling and worrying about their stores, became short-tempered. This was the psychology of confinement, the fear that the walls were closing in, not just physically, but mentally, threatening to break the familial unity that was their primary defense. While Liam waged his physical battle against the snow and the cold, Moira fought her own silent battle at the hearth. She stretched every sack of flour, combining it with ground-dried roots and what little preserved meat they had. She resurrected old recipes from Ireland, long-forgotten knowledge that turned scraps into sustenance. She carefully melted snow for water, ensuring it was boiled clean for tea. Her constant work, mending, cooking, cleaning, was an act of defiance against the chaos outside. The skill of the hearth was the real reason they were surviving. It was a continuous, invisible labor that maintained order and hope. One bitter afternoon, while digging for a piece of misplaced equipment beneath the floorboards, Finn made a vital discovery. Under a loose stone near the foundation, they found a small leather-wrapped packet. It was a hidden store left by the previous, unseen owner of the land, a small cache of dried beans, salt, and most miraculously, a small bag of dried medicinal herbs. The unexpected bonus, though small, was a massive psychological victory. It was a sign that the land, which had been so cruel, had not entirely forgotten them. It was a reminder that they were part of a long chain of survival. As the winter deepened into January, the fear was almost absolute. The wind howled relentlessly, and their fuel stores were nearing a critical low. The family huddled together one evening, shivering despite their blankets. Liam pulled out the family Bible, the relic that had survived the Atlantic crossing. He did not read from it, but simply held it, and together they offered a prayer, not for rescue, but for strength. It was the deepest call, a raw, desperate affirmation of life in the face of death. They were praying for dawn, not just the return of the sun, but the dawn of a new season. The breaking point arrived with the worst possible timing. Anae, the youngest, woke up burning with fever. In their isolation, they had no doctor, no medicine, and only Finn's meager knowledge of herbs. Moira, usually unshakable, dissolved into tears. Liam felt a cold, final despair. He had defeated the crown, the ocean, the land speculator, and the vigilantes, but he could not defeat the simple, unseen sickness of Anae. He strapped a small shovel to his back, grabbed his rifle, and told Moira he had to go for help, a dangerous, potentially fatal ride to the Jensens, 10 miles away through the high snowdrifts. He was stopped before he reached the end of his own property line. The wind shifted, and through a brief clearing in the swirling snow, he saw it, a tiny plume of dark smoke rising in the distance. It was the power of the signal, a fire lit high on a ridge, placed there by Lars Jensen. Lars had become concerned and had established a remote signal fire plan with Liam months ago, a trust beyond sight and sound. Lars was calling to him, checking on their status. Liam rushed back, lit their own stack of oily rags, and sent back a desperate prearranged signal for need aid. The wait was agonizing, but Lars Jensen arrived the next morning, appearing like a Viking through the swirling snow, pulling a heavy sleigh. He had brought what the O'Malleys needed, a rare cough syrup, a small bag of dried jerky, and most importantly, the simple, solid presence of a neighbor. Lars's arrival was a moment of profound emotional relief, a physical manifestation of the bond forged in ice. His appearance was not just an act of kindness, it was a testament to the strength of the community they had built, the ultimate answer to the vigilantes who sought only self-interest. Anae recovered, and then at the end of February, the great siege broke. The wind softened, the skies cleared to a brilliant blue, and the relentless sun began the slow, massive work of melting the drifts. The thaw brought a profound, exhausted relief, but also the reckoning. The cattle were thin, the wood stores were gone, and the ground was soaked. They had survived, but they were weak, and the price of survival had been heavy. Liam stood in his clearing, looking at the immense snowdrifts that still covered his field. It was time to start over again. As spring finally arrived, the New Hope community emerged, battered but unbroken. They gathered at the schoolhouse, sharing their stories of the long winter and helping one another mend broken fences and plow the wet fields. They had endured against all odds. The legacy of resilience was not just the survival of their bodies, but the strengthening of their spirits. Liam looked at his family and his neighbors, no longer simply settlers, but a band of survivors bound by shared trauma. The winter had been a test of God, nature, and man, and they had passed. They had earned the right to the renewal of the spring.
Wyoming, you are riding to war for a rancher who doesn't even know your names, Kelly scoffed, raising his own rifle. You are a coward, O'Malley, an Indian lover. Liam stood his ground, pointing his rifle into the dirt. Choosing the cost is what defines a free man. You ride and you condemn us all. The confrontation froze. The men, their fear momentarily replaced by confusion, looked between the two leaders. It was then that Finn's defining choice changed the calculus. 12-year-old Finn O'Malley, riding beside his father, slowly raised his small, smoothbore shotgun, pointing it not at the men, but directly at the barbed wire fence that marked the Kellys' claim. You want to ride to war through a lie? Finn's young voice cracked.
then you can ride through your own fences, because this land is watching and it knows the truth." This act of defiance, a boy witnessing the moral decay, shamed several of the younger men, who slowly lowered their weapons. The image of the son ready to defend his father's morality was more powerful than any bullet. The vigilante group fractured. A handful, still committed to the violence, rode on, but the majority, facing the moral shame and Liam's unwavering certainty, turned back. The retreat was not a victory, but a necessary de-escalation. The consequences, however, were harsh. The Kellys and their remaining allies refused to speak to the O'Malleys or the Jensens. They cut themselves off, refusing to participate in community ventures or the schoolhouse. This was the internal exile, a wound in the heart of New Hope. The community was saved from external war, but deeply scarred by internal hatred. The shadow of conflict now lay not just over the land, but within the town itself. The work of restoration was slow and difficult. The O'Malleys, the Jensens, and the remaining loyal families redoubled their efforts to strengthen their bonds. They began physically mending the fences that the Kellys had torn down, not just their property fences, but the communal ones. They sent a delegation to the tribal agency to deliver a formal apology and a small gift of grain, a gesture meant to rebuild the trust destroyed by the vigilantes. This was not the quick drama of violence, but the slow, persistent labor of morality, the real work of building a society. Years later, the Kellys' land was sold. They had failed to thrive in their self-imposed isolation and hatred. The New Hope community survived and eventually grew into a proper town, but the scars remained. The legacy of discord served as a continuous, quiet reminder. Liam O'Malley, now a respected leader, often told the story to the children in the schoolhouse, not just of the stolen cattle, but of the moral choice. He taught them that the most dangerous seeds of the future were not in the ground, but in the heart. The shadow of conflict was a permanent part of the frontier, teaching them that true American success wasn't just about clearing the land, but about clearing the conscience. The summer that followed the Seeds of Discord incident was long and temperate, yielding an enormous harvest. Yet as October turned to November, an unsettling stillness fell over the Nebraska prairie. The veteran settlers, like Lars Jensen, noted the unnatural silence and the early thick coats on the livestock. This was the haste before the chill. Liam O'Malley, taking the premonition seriously, worked frantically, racing the clock. He hauled extra firewood from the riverbank, sealed the final chinks in the timber house with mud and straw, and dug a massive root cellar. He doubled the grain stores and packed the sod roof with an extra layer of hay. Everything they had fought for, the land, the community, the children's future, now depended on their ability to withstand the winter's inevitable test. The storm struck on the first day of December. It was not a gentle snowfall, but an immediate, ferocious blizzard's opening. Driven by winds that shrieked like banshees, the snow descended as a blinding, opaque white wall. Within hours, the world outside the O'Malley windows vanished. Liam attempted to secure the barn door, but was driven back by the sheer force of the gale, barely making it inside. The temperature plummeted, and the air was thick with flying ice. This was no ordinary storm. It was a climactic siege, cutting off the homestead not just from the outside world, but from the immediate vicinity of the barn, only 50 feet away. Inside the small timber house, with the stove roaring and the windows banked with snow, the initial feeling was of snug safety. but this quickly gave way to a profound sense of isolation. The storm raged for 3 days without pause. When the wind momentarily died down, the sound of nothing else was terrifying. No bird song, no rattle of wagon wheels, no distant lowing of a neighbor's cow. Just an immense, smothering silence, broken only by the crackle of their own fire. Moira, always the most resilient, began to ration the coffee and flour. They were entirely alone, trapped in a house of wood and earth, surrounded by an immense, frozen, deadly immensity. The most pressing and terrifying threat was the fate of their livestock. The 2 milk cows, the oxen, and the remaining chickens were their lifeblood. They represented food, transport, and the ability to plant next spring. By the 3rd day, the snowdrifts were higher than the roof. Liam knew he had to reach the barn. After a desperate hour of tunneling through the heavy, packed snow, he finally broke through into the cramped, dark space. The animals were alive, but hungry, their water buckets frozen solid. Liam spent the next 4 hours shoveling out a narrow, 20-foot trench, a lifeline tunnel between the house and the barn. Realizing this dangerous, constant task would be his prison until spring. The snow eventually stopped, but the cold did not. An Arctic front settled over the plains, bringing temperatures that dropped far below zero. The well, dug with so much effort, began to freeze deeper than our bucket could reach. Every morning, Liam had to chip away at the ice layer. Even inside the house, moisture froze on the windows closest to the exterior wall. This was the scythe of the cold, pruning away their comfort and their confidence. The dream of the thriving farm, the symbol of their frozen hope, was now itself threatened by a literal physical freezing. The long, dark days demanded a severe regime of rationing. Fuel was the most critical concern. The woodpile, once so comforting, was shrinking fast. Liam calculated their supply against the weeks that lay ahead, determining that they could only afford to keep the main stove burning for 12 hours a day, allowing the house to plunge into a painful chill at night. Moira, therefore, began rationing the light. Tallow candles were saved for absolute necessity. Evenings were spent in near darkness, the only illumination coming from the dull glow of the cooling stove. The hours were filled not with reading or talk, but with the quiet, shared anxiety of survival. The children huddled close for warmth.
5 years after winning their battle against the land speculator Thorne, the O'Malley homestead, along with the entire New Hope community, had entered a period of relative prosperity. The fields yielded a reliable harvest, the cattle herd was growing, and the schoolhouse was fully functional, taught by a circuit-riding teacher in the summers and by Finn O'Malley in the winters. But this stability proved to have a double edge. The success of the small farms attracted attention, the kind that bred resentment and ultimately competition. The prairie, once viewed as an endless resource, was now being carved up into valuable, finite parcels, and every fence line became a potential battle line. The core of the burgeoning discord lay in the great fencing debate. Liam O'Malley and Lars Jensen favored building low, sturdy post and rail fences sufficient to keep their own livestock in, but allowing neighbors and local game easy passage. However, 2 new families who had recently bought Thorne's failed land, the rough, independent Kellys, began erecting vast, impenetrable stretches of barbed wire. This new technology was cheap, effective, and brutal. The Kellys argued that it protected their investment. Liam argued that it was greedy, dangerous, and violated the communal spirit upon which the settlement was founded. The barbed wire became a physical manifestation of the ideological rift between self-interest and community principle. The tension with the Kellys was quickly eclipsed by a more dangerous problem: the shadow of conflict with the outside world. The remaining local indigenous tribes, largely confined to distant reservations, still utilized ancient trails across the unplowed prairie to hunt. For years, an uneasy implicit treaty had existed. The settlers farmed and the tribes passed. That treaty was violently broken one night when a dozen head of the O'Malley's and Jensen's cattle vanished. They found no tracks, only the sign of swift, skilled work. Lars, usually placid, was furious. The tribes wouldn't steal so carelessly, Liam. It was done by outsiders, trying to stir up trouble. Liam, however, remembered the scout and the warning. He knew the frontier was a complex net of loyalties, and something vital had shifted. The cattle theft ignited a fearful, angry reaction in New Hope. The Kellys and a new cluster of tough, unattached ranchers immediately began advocating for vengeance, demanding the formation of a vigilante peace committee to track the thieves and hold the nearby reservation accountable. Fear took root quickly, overriding reason. Moira O'Malley, holding Ain tight, looked at her husband. "They seek war, Liam, so they can claim more land." Liam, supported by Lars and the circuit teacher, argued passionately for patience and investigation. But the rising voices of the hardliners were gaining momentum. The community was no longer united by common toil, but divided by suspicion. The tension came to a head at a heated town meeting held in the one-room schoolhouse. It was meant to discuss funding, but devolved into a shouting match over defense. The room, the very symbol of their future hope, was divided. On one side stood the proponents of aggressive action, led by the Kellys, arguing that weakness invites attack. On the other stood the original settlers, led by Liam and Lars, arguing that justice must precede the gun. The soft-spoken circuit teacher, Mr. Davies, stood before the blackboard, nervously tapping his pointer. Liam realized this was the true test of leadership, not managing a crop, but managing men's fear. He proposed they send 2 men, one settler and one impartial member, to the tribal agent to formally inquire rather than take up arms. The vote was close, but the measure passed, delaying the call for vigilantes, for now. Liam volunteered to go, taking Lars Jensen with him. It was a long ride east, 3 days across the untamed prairie to the agency office near the river. The journey gave the 2 men ample time for counsel. Liam trusted Lars implicitly, but doubt gnawed at him. What if the Kellys were right? What if the tribes, pushed to the edge, had resorted to stealing? The weight of the community's safety pressed down on them. They were not just seeking cattle. They were seeking to diffuse a looming, potentially devastating shadow of conflict that could erase everything they had built. When they arrived at the agency, they were met with a bored, overworked, and deeply cynical federal agent, a man named Mr. Finch. Finch listened to their story with a chilling lack of interest. "Cattle theft? Happens all the time, O'Malley. Settlers steal from Indians, Indians steal from settlers. We can't police 50,000 square miles." Finch pointed to his desk, piled high with useless paperwork. "The government sends promises and starvation rations, Mr. O'Malley, not justice. The tribes are desperate. And frankly, the rail money is coming, and no one cares what happens to them or your cows." The bureaucracy of neglect was the hardest truth Liam had ever encountered. The realization that their lives and the lives of the indigenous people were equally expendable to the powerful forces governing the territory. Discouraged, Liam and Lars rested at a small, rough trading post near the river. There, Liam had a chance encounter with a lone traveling Pawnee scout, the same man who had warned him years ago. Liam cautiously approached the scout, offering him tobacco. The scout accepted, listening to Liam's account of the theft. The scout then spoke, not in the language of the plains, but in broken English, pointing to the east. "Not this land's people. Stealers wear big hats, drive cattle far, quick, bad men from Wyoming." He described the different culprit, not local tribal members, but large, well-organized cattle barons from the north, testing the territory's defenses. The whispers of the river camp confirmed Lars's initial suspicion and deepened Liam's resolve. The seeds of discord were being sown deliberately by powerful, unseen interests. Liam and Lars returned to New Hope with the truth. The theft was orchestrated by organized rustlers, likely employed by a massive Wyoming syndicate aiming to annex the Nebraska grasslands for open-range grazing, and the blame had been intentionally laid upon the indigenous population to incite warfare. However, they found an unwelcome fact. The hardliners preferred their own, simpler narrative. The Kellys scoffed at the foreigner's gossip. They wanted a scapegoat, not a complex conspiracy. The shadow of conflict had less to do with who stole the cattle and everything to do with who held the power. The tension reached its breaking point. Ignoring Liam's account, the Kellys organized the vigilantes' muster. 20 men, armed and grim, gathered near the newly erected barbed wire fence. Their plan? Ride to the tribal lands and demand reparations or take livestock. This unauthorized action posed a massive peril to the entire community. If the vigilantes attacked a reservation, the response from the U.S. Army or the tribes themselves would be swift, devastating, and indiscriminate, sparing no farm. Liam knew he had to act fast. He had to halt the violence, even if it meant risking his life and his own reputation. Liam, armed with his hunting rifle, rode out with Lars and Finn to intercept the vigilantes at the eastern edge of their claim. It was the stand at the line, the moment the civil dispute became a physical confrontation. Liam rode directly into the path of the Kellys. "You ride under a lie," Liam shouted, his voice echoing across the silent fields. "The thieves are white men from Wyoming."
Liam returned to Thorne's temporary office, a stiffly formal room in the nearest tiny railhead town, to pay the lien. Thorne was visibly annoyed that the scheme had failed, but his composure was iron. He then renewed his offer for the land, increasing the cash sum substantially. "You are foolish, O'Malley," Thorne sneered. "The rail will bring a boom, but also taxes, lawyers, and crowds. Sell now, walk away rich, and move a bit further west, where the air is still clean. Why anchor yourself to those peasants and their small debts?" This was the test of loyalty, a direct choice between the security of his own family's wealth and his moral obligation to the community. Liam looked at the money, then thought of Lars's unwavering eye and Moira's fierce pride. Liam pushed the offer back across the desk. "A hard bargain, Mr. Thorne," Liam stated, his voice steady, "but I will not sell. The price of this land is not for cash. It is paid in my family's sweat and my neighbor's faith." Thorne's smooth facade cracked. His eyes narrowed with cold fury. "You have made a grave mistake, O'Malley," he warned. "You think you defeated me with $200? I control the local bank. I control the supply line. You will not have access to credit for seed or feed. I will build the rail station on the land around you, cutting off your access road. Your loyalty will be your ruin." The retaliation was instant and terrifyingly effective. The immediate consequence of the refusal landed not on Liam, but on his eldest son, Finn. The schoolhouse the community was planning was still a dream, and Finn, 12 years old, was restless and smart, desperate for books. Thorne's retaliation meant the family would have to conserve every penny. That evening, Liam told Finn the hard truth. There would be no money for books, no break from the fieldwork, and no chance for the city school until the threat passed. Finn, initially crushed, straightened his shoulders. "I'll work harder, Da," he said, swallowing his disappointment. "I'll find a way." Finn's sacrifice, the temporary death of his intellectual dreams, was the deepest boy's burden of the hard bargain. The price of the land was now being paid in the coinage of his son's education. Thorn was true to his word. An economic winter immediately descended upon the homestead. When Liam went to the nearest store to buy essential iron fittings for a new plow, the owner, an agent of Thorn's controlled bank, turned him away, citing insufficient credit history. The O'Malleys were effectively frozen out of the market. They couldn't sell their surplus grain to the distant markets without the necessary wagons and team, and they couldn't buy new stock or tools. They were forced into a self-sufficiency that was almost as difficult as their first year on the prairie. They mended old tools, traded grain directly with the Jensens for necessary repairs, and relied entirely on the shared resources of their tiny, struggling settlement. The psychological warfare was worse. Thorn sent his men not to attack, but to intimidate. The surveyor's line began to creep around the O'Malley claim. Thorn had purchased the land to the north and the south, and his new stakes defined his property boundaries with aggressive precision, clearly demarcating the end of Liam's road access to the river. The encroachment was legal but malicious. Liam and Moira spent weeks watching the men, rifle close at hand, guarding their actual land but powerless to stop the construction of a heavy barbed wire fence that began to enclose them, making them feel like prisoners on their own farm. Thorn's plan was to isolate and crush. The community, however, responded with a resilience that surprised even Liam. Lars Jensen rode to each family in the settlement and declared a fence-building day. 2 weeks later, 10 wagons and 15 men arrived at the O'Malley claim. They worked all day, not tearing down Thorn's fence, but building a solid, thick wooden road that crossed the far corner of the Jensen property and connected Liam's farm directly to the main trail. It was a massive collective labor, a physical demonstration of the community's defiance and loyalty. Thorn could control the bank, but he could not control the neighborly spirit of the frontier. The road was their message. Liam was not alone. The defiance had an impact. Thorn, realizing that he couldn't easily starve out a man supported by an entire network, shifted tactics. He tried to buy the road easement from Lars Jensen, offering a large sum. Lars refused. Then Thorn offered the same deal to the other settlers. Each of them, having paid the price of the collective loan and witnessed Liam's struggle, refused the money. Liam realized that their loyalty was their true capital. It was a resource more valuable and less fleeting than cash. This lesson of the stone wall, the impenetrable unity of the settlers, was the ultimate rebuttal to Thorn's cynicism. 5 years later, Mr. Calvin Thorn was ruined. He had overextended his credit, the rail route was delayed, and his predatory tactics had earned him the enmity of the entire territory. His large, fenced-in land claims went untended and were eventually sold for taxes. The O'Malley farm, however, thrived. The new road was now the main route, and the small schoolhouse had finally been built. Finn was teaching the younger children, fulfilling his deferred dream. Standing on his porch, watching the smoke rise from Lars Jensen's chimney across the fields, Liam knew the true title to his land was not the deed in his strongbox, but the unbroken bond with his neighbors. He had faced the hard bargain of the American frontier, the choice between personal gain and collective survival. His decision had cost him years of struggle, but it had yielded a profound reward. His success was not measured in gold or acreage, but in loyalty and community. Liam O'Malley had paid the price of land and loyalty, and in the process, truly become an American.
4 years had passed since Liam O'Malley drove his first axe fall. The homestead, now boasting a small, timber-framed house and a promising stand of wheat, represented a victory carved out of the relentless prairie. The second harvest had been abundant, a bounty that finally lifted the cloud of absolute fear. Liam paid off the last of his initial supply debts to the distant mercantile house and even bought Moira a proper cooking stove. For the first time since leaving Ireland, their small family felt a glimmer of solvency. They were not rich, but they were standing upright, rooted firmly to their 160 acres. This land was no longer just a promise on paper, it was a testament to their endurance. The great local topic of conversation, discussed over shared coffee at the Jensen farm, was the railroad. Surveyors had appeared 2 months prior, mapping a route that was slated to pass within 5 miles of the O'Malley and Jensen claims. The rail's promise was intoxicating. It meant easy transport for their grain, access to markets, and most crucially, a dramatic heightened value for their land. Suddenly, the O'Malley farm was no longer remote, it was prime. Liam felt a rush of justified pride. His gamble had paid off. The frontier was coming to them, bringing civilization, opportunity, and capital. The rail excitement, however, drew attention Liam hadn't anticipated. One blustery Tuesday, a well-dressed man on a magnificent bay mare rode into the clearing. This was not the circuit preacher, but a sharp, calculating figure, Mr. Calvin Thorne, a land agent and speculative buyer from Omaha. Thorne's clothes were tailored, his boots polished, and his manner was all smooth urban confidence. He surveyed the O'Malley homestead with a critical, appraising eye. He represented the rider from Omaha, the forces of high finance and capital that were now reaching their long, exploitative fingers into the Great Plains. Mr. Thorne dismounted and, without preamble, pulled a chair to the porch. He spread a large, detailed map on the table, pointing to the square marked with Liam's name. "Mr. O'Malley," he began, his voice dry and devoid of warmth, "I represent interests that require land adjacent to the forthcoming rail terminus. Your section, sir, is ideally situated." He mentioned the railroad's proximity and the anticipated town development. Then came the first offer, a cash sum that was 3 times what Liam had spent building the homestead. It was a tantalizing sum, enough to pay for a comfortable stone house, a new team of oxen, and schooling for the children in a proper city. Liam's breath caught. He stammered a refusal, stating that the land was not for sale. Thorne merely smiled, an unsettling lack of surprise in his eyes. "Think on it, Mr. O'Malley. Opportunity is a fleeting commodity." Before leaving, Thorne delivered a parting shot that instantly extinguished Liam's sense of solvency. He produced a legal document, a lien filed by the very mercantile house Liam had thought he'd paid off. The document revealed that the owner of the mercantile house, facing his own financial troubles, had sold the last vestiges of his debt portfolio to Mr. Thorne. "This promissory note, Mr. O'Malley, for your winter supplies, $200, is now due, not in a year, but next week, and the interest has been adjusted." The new amount, swollen by Thorne's inflated rates, was impossible to pay. It was a calculated trap, a demonstration of the small trend of debt designed to choke the small farmer. Liam was back where he started, a man enslaved by the need for money. Liam immediately rode to the Jensen farm. He found Lars and Ingrid in their yard mending harnesses. With shame, Liam revealed Thorne's visit and the devastating lien. Lars listened, his face hardening as the truth sunk in. "He tried the same trick with the Svensson claim north of us, but they are older. They had cash." The next night, the small community gathered. The O'Malleys, the Jensens, and 2 other families. This meeting of hands transformed into a council of war. Liam laid out the facts, and the settlers confirmed their shared suspicion. Thorne was buying up the best land near the future rail lines using predatory debt, threatening to break up their fledgling society. The settlers knew Liam could not pay the debt in time. They proposed a solution born of necessity and loyalty, a collective loan. Each family would contribute a portion of their meager savings and a share of their stored grain, enough to cover Thorne's immediate claim. "You pay us back next harvest, Liam," Lars insisted. "No interest. We need to hear. We will not let him break the covenant." The grandeur, himself facing his own financial troubles, had sold the last vestiges of his debt portfolio to Mr. Thorne. "This promissory note, Mr. O'Malley, for your winter supplies, $200, is now due, not in a year, but next week.
and the interest has been adjusted. The new amount, swollen by Thorne's inflated rates, was impossible to pay. It was a calculated trap, a demonstration of the small print of debt designed to choke the small farmer. Liam was back where he started, a man enslaved by the need for money. Liam immediately rode to the Jensen farm. He found Lars and Ingrid in their yard mending harnesses. With shame, Liam revealed Thorne's visit and the devastating lien. Lars listened, his face hardening as the truth sunk in. He tried the same trick with the Svensson claim north of us, but they are older. They had cash. The next night, the small community gathered. The O'Malleys, the Jensens, and 2 other families. This meeting of hands transformed into a council of war. Liam laid out the facts, and the settlers confirmed their shared suspicion. Thorne was buying up the best land near the future rail lines using predatory debt, threatening to break up their fledgling society. The settlers knew Liam could not pay the debt in time. They proposed a solution born of necessity and loyalty, a collective loan. Each family would contribute a portion of their meager savings and a share of their stored grain, enough to cover Thorne's immediate claim. "You pay us back next harvest, Liam," Lars insisted. "No interest. We need you here. We will not let him break the covenant."
The next day, Silas stayed to help with chores, an unexpected payment for the meal. He was a skilled laborer, but his worldview was fundamentally at odds with Liam's. Liam believed in planting and waiting. Silas believed in digging and taking. "You waste your time, Irishman," Silas scoffed, watching Liam mend a fence post. "All this dirt and effort for a patch of potatoes. The only thing of value comes from the earth's belly, not its surface. You should sell this farm and follow the rail line west. There's gold in Montana yet." This was the clash of philosophies, the settler's land versus the miner's gold. Liam calmly shook his head. "Gold is found only once, Silas. Soil is worked every season. I'm building a future, not seeking a gamble." Before he left, Silas made a genuine offer. He had seen Liam's strength and Finn's quick hands. He proposed that Liam sell the farm or lease it and join him on the westward journey. "I know how to travel light and fast. We could be rich men by Christmas." For a brief, dizzying moment, Liam felt the temptation. It was the easy American promise of instant fortune, a siren song for any man who had known poverty. But then he looked at his sturdy walls, at Moira knitting by the window, and at the small dark furrows in the field. He refused. Silas accepted the refusal of the road with a grim nod. He understood. He had chosen the wild, ephemeral dream. Liam had chosen the hard, permanent reality. They parted with a handshake, 2 men who had shared fire and fear, but who walked opposite paths into the west. Silas left as abruptly as he came, disappearing into the cold horizon. The warmth he had brought to the hearth was replaced by a residue of cynicism. Liam felt the need to clean the soddy, as if scrubbing away the dirt and doubt Silas had left behind. He scrubbed the table and swept the floor. Moira noticed the tension. "He unsettled you, Liam," she said. "The land does not judge us so harshly as men like him." Liam sighed. "He showed me the dark corners of the frontier, Moira, the kind of greed and loneliness we must fight, not with an axe, but with our community. We must keep our hearts as clean as our well water." The encounter had not broken their resolve, but it had sharpened their awareness of the unseen human dangers surrounding their isolated existence. 2 weeks later, the silence was again broken, this time by the rhythmic clang of a small brass bell. A dust-caked messenger appeared, the Reverend Elias Thorne, a circuit preacher covering the newly settled counties. Reverend Thorne was a man of energy and simple faith, dressed in neat but threadbare black. He carried his church in a saddlebag, a worn Bible, a folding stool, and a bell. He was not selling gold or seeking trouble. He was collecting souls. He had ridden from the nearest town, New Hope, and was making a call to assembly for a Sunday service at the Jensen's homestead,
the most centrally located soddy. For the O'Malleys, it was a summons to something they hadn't realized they were missing, a connection to civilization. The following Sunday, the O'Malley family dressed in their best, slightly threadbare clothes and rode the horses to the Jensens' claim. They found a dozen other settlers, Swedes, Germans, a couple from Kentucky, and an unmarried man from Massachusetts, a gathering of patches stitched together by the Homestead Act. The service was held outside, in the sun. The makeshift congregation sat on overturned buckets and hay bales. The sight of so many different faces in the clearing, all sharing the same hard-earned solitude and the same cautious hope, was profoundly moving. They sang hymns in 3 different languages and listened to Reverend Thorne's powerful voice. Reverend Thorne's sermon's edge was sharp and practical. He spoke not of distant angels, but of immediate neighbors. God has given you this land, but he will not fence it, nor will he keep the fire away. Your salvation is not only in prayer, but in the sweat you share. Help one another with the sickness. Watch the children. Build a school. Your covenant of community is your shield against the wilderness. His message resonated deeply with Liam. The frontier demanded self-reliance, but survival demanded teamwork. The greatest strength of the New World was not its endless land, but the promise of a self-made society. After the sermon, the settlers didn't immediately leave. They lingered, sharing dried jerky and discussing shared problems, the shortage of seed, the need for a mail route, and the problem of educating the children. The spirit of the sermon took practical root. They pooled a small, meager fund of coins and paper money, the schoolhouse fund. They agreed that starting in the spring, they would spend 1 Saturday a month cutting logs and digging stone for a small shared building near the creek. This act of collective creation, this commitment to the children's future, was the true building of the future. It cemented the relationship between the scattered homesteads, transforming them from isolated claims into a fledgling town. As Liam rode home with Moira and the children, the sun setting and the prairie wind cool on their faces, the loneliness of the horizon felt finally genuinely lessened. They were no longer solely dependent on the axe and the gun. They had an external framework, the Jensens, the Reverend, the prospect of the schoolhouse. Liam had stared down the wildness of the land and the wildness of human nature. He had encountered the fear of the scout, the cynicism of the gold seeker, and the hope of the preacher. He looked at Moira, whose spirit seemed lighter than it had in years. He said, "We have a town now, Moira. It doesn't have walls or streets yet, but it has a heart." The physical clearing was done, but the social settlement's heart was just beginning to beat, promising an end to the isolation and the true beginning of their American life.
The O'Malley homestead, 3 years into the Nebraska venture, was a sturdy collection of sod and timber, but it remained an island. Their nearest neighbors, the Jensens, were a day's hard ride away. One late afternoon, as the sun dipped toward the horizon, casting long, deceptive shadows across the plowed field, Liam felt the prickle of being watched. He was chopping firewood near the recently cleared fire break when he paused, sensing a stillness that was unnatural. He did not hear a twig snap or a stone roll. He felt a disruption in the silence itself. Turning slowly, his heart hammering against his ribs, he saw it, a shadow, tall and utterly motionless, standing where the prairie grass met the raw earth of their claim. It was an indigenous man, dressed in worn buckskin, holding a bow and a quiver full of arrows. He was a quiet intruder, and he stared directly at Liam. Liam froze, his axe held low. He was only a few feet from the rifle propped against the soddy wall, but moving toward it would be a declaration of war. He and Moira had heard the stories, tales of skirmishes and stolen cattle, but they had seen no local tribesmen until now. The man made no aggressive move. He simply watched. Liam swallowed hard, lowering his axe to the dirt in a gesture he hoped was one of peace. He tried a few words of broken English, then Polish, then his native Irish. Silence was the only language the scout offered. The tension was immense, a thick, palpable thing woven with fear and curiosity. After perhaps a full minute, an eternity on the prairie, the man nodded once, a nearly imperceptible movement, before turning with fluid grace and melting back into the tall grass. He had not taken anything, nor had he asked for anything. He had merely observed. Liam rushed inside, breathless, relaying the encounter to Moira in a torrent of urgent whispers. He wanted to mount the horse, check the cattle, and stand guard with the rifle. Moira, however, looked not at the rifle, but at the cooling loaf of bread on the counter. "He looked hungry, Liam," she said simply. "Not angry, just hungry." The next morning, before the sun was fully up, Moira went to the edge of the firebreak. Following a sudden, strong intuition, she placed the remaining half loaf of bread and a wooden bowl of fresh well water on a flat stone. She backed away quickly, retreating to the safety of the house. From the window they watched. Nothing happened, but later, when Liam checked, the stone was empty and the bowl was gone. It was a gesture of respect, a small, quiet treaty between the settlers and the spirit of the plains, secured by the offering of bread. A week later, the scout reappeared. This time he stood near the cattle pen at midday. He was not menacing, but purposeful. He pointed with an open hand to the north, then drew a short, sharp line in the dust with a stick, and finally pointed to their well. He repeated the motion with urgency. Liam quickly summoned Lars Jensen, his nearest neighbor. Lars, who had spent time logging near Dakota, understood. "He is saying travelers are coming from the north, and they are not good. They will contaminate your water." It was a tracker's warning, a debt repaid for the bread. They quickly concealed their best tools and supplies. The sign in the ashes of the dry earth was a brutal education. On the frontier, trust could not be given lightly, but it was often found in the most unexpected and fearful faces in the clearing. The scout's warning proved true. 2 days later, a pair of rough-looking trappers passed, asking rude questions about the farm and demanding water. They left without incident, deterred by the 2 men standing guard. The scout never returned, but the encounter left an indelible mark on Liam. He began to leave small gifts, a pouch of tobacco, a discarded tool at the edge of their claim. He looked at the vast surrounding prairie not just as an obstacle to be cleared, but as a domain with its own rules, its own inhabitants, and its own silent observers. He had learned the lesson of the great silence. Survival on the frontier depended on the hard work of the axe, but also on the quiet, necessary respecting of the wild. 6 months passed without another strange encounter. Then, in the deep chill of a dry, bitter winter, a lone figure appeared, trudging across the frozen fields. He was tall, gaunt, and wrapped in layers of filthy wool. His name was Silas Kane, and he had the look of a man who had seen too much sun and too little kindness. Liam approached him cautiously. As they talked, a large prairie rattlesnake, sluggish but lethal in the cold, uncoiled near the barn door. Silas, with the speed that belied his weariness, pulled a small, worn hatchet from his belt and severed the snake's head with a single brutal swing. "Bad luck, those," he spat, wiping the blade on the ground. Silas was a stranger with hard edges, a former prospector returning east from a failed search in the Black Hills. Liam, however, grateful for the saved livestock, offered Silas food and a place by the fire for the night. Silas ate silently, his eyes darting around the warm sod house, but his demeanor was closed and suspicious. He spoke only to answer direct questions, and then only in clipped, cynical sentences. Later, as Liam and Silas sat smoking by the hearth, the weight of the past began to press on the prospector. He finally began to talk of fortunes lost, partners betrayed, and the dehumanizing isolation of the gold rush camps. His stories were dark, filled with greed and violence, a stark contrast to the quiet hope of the O'Malley farm. He was a mirror reflecting the ugliness of the American dream, a man consumed by the frontier's endless, brutal promise of wealth. His confession by the fire was not an act of friendship, but a necessary purging.
The prairie was not empty, it was merely wild. Their crops attracted creatures unfamiliar and destructive. Gophers tunneled beneath the soddy,
coyotes stalked the edges of their land, and, most terrifyingly, the bison herds occasionally passed, capable of trampling a year's work in minutes. The greatest fear, however, was fire. A stray spark, a summer lightning strike, or a carelessly dropped match could turn the dry grass into an inferno. Liam spent precious days plowing a deep fire break around their entire property, a final defense against the silent intruder. They learned to read the sky for smoke and to listen for the distinctive, anxious call of prairie birds that warned of a presence. They were not conquering the land, Liam realized. They were negotiating a tense truce with it. More crushing than the physical labor was the loneliness of the horizon. Days bled into weeks, and they saw no one. Their world shrank to the dimensions of their 160 acres. Moira missed the noise and gossip of the Boston tenement. Liam missed the companionship of the forge. The children spoke only to each other or to the gentle workhorses. One evening, after a month without a visitor, Moira broke down, weeping into her soup. "I cannot bear the silence, Liam. It swallows my voice." Liam took her hand. He too felt the deep, oppressive void. He knew that for the homestead to survive, the family needed to connect. He resolved to ride 10 miles south to the tiny, rumored settlement called New Hope, just to see another human face. The autumn harvest of their first year was meager, enough potatoes to survive, but little else. Yet as the bitter winter set in, the turning of the year brought a fresh perspective. They had survived. Their soddy stood. Their well held water. When the thaw came, Liam worked the field again, planting their limited supply of seed corn and wheat. This was the true gamble, the ultimate act of faith. He covered the seed carefully, knowing that their fate lay entirely within the dark, moist earth. This small act of planting was heavier with hope than any church service. One humid afternoon, just as Liam was patching the soddy roof, a second wagon appeared on the horizon. It was a Swedish family, the Jensens, who had claimed the quarter section just to their west. The meeting was awkward, but instantly profound. There were handshakes, shared coffee, and the joyous, immediate connection between the children. Lars Jensen, burly and quiet, was a former sailor who knew how to build a stronger roof. His wife, Ingrid, brought fresh bread and the promise of conversation for Moira. The neighbors from nowhere immediately changed the character of the land. They were no longer a lonely speck. They were a community of two, and in this, Liam saw the blueprint for the entire territory's future. The children adapted faster than their parents. Finn and Ein, initially frightened by the openness, now treated the prairie as their colossal playground. They spoke in a new, blended dialect, a mix of Moira's soft Irish lilt and the quick, clipped English they picked up from the few other settlers. They learned to identify the calls of birds, the scent of rain on dry soil, and the difference between edible and poisonous berries. They were children of the prairie, their senses tuned to the language of the land. When Liam and Moira spoke of Ireland, the children listened with a kind of polite distance. Their roots were no longer in the green, distant past, but here, in the sun-baked, endless present. The dream of a proper wooden house, the sign of permanence, was still years away. But Liam was determined to plant something that would last. Using a precious reserve of water from the well, he planted a dozen small cottonwood seedlings near the soddy. They were thin, brittle sticks, but they represented more than shelter. They were a promise of shade, timber, and civilization. The first tree was a ceremony. Liam dug the holes deep, fertilized them with precious manure, and watered them every dry evening. They were the mark against the sky, a symbol of the future family homestead, the proof that the O'Malleys were not just passing through, but were here to stay and grow. 7 years after the first axe fall, the O'Malleys no longer lived in the soddy. They had a small, sturdy, timber-framed house built with wood hauled from a commercial rail line 40 miles away. The fence posts were solid, the fields productive, and the cottonwood saplings stood taller than Finn. Liam stood on his porch, watching Finn, now a confident teenager, plow the last section of field. The land was no longer untamed territory. It was theirs. He put his arm around Moira, whose face was lined by sun and worry, but whose eyes held the same steady light. The wealth they had sought was not gold or silver, but the inheritance of hardship, the deep, earned satisfaction of owning the land they had suffered for. "We did well, Liam," Moira murmured, watching their son work the soil. "We made a home," Liam corrected, his voice rough with emotion. "And that, Moira, is a greater legacy than any crown could grant." The whisper of the old world was finally silent, replaced by the steady, comforting sigh of the prairie wind across their own field.
The paper trembled in Liam O'Malley's hand, less a legal document and more a sacred contract. It was the Homestead Act claim for 160 acres in the Nebraska Territory, a square of earth he had never seen, granted by a government he barely understood. After 7 years toiling in the sweatshops of Boston, Liam had traded the grime of the city for the dust of the Great Plains. He knelt on the wagon's hard floor, his wife, Moira, peering over his shoulder, their 2 young children, Finn and Ain, asleep beside them. The map was simple, a crude grid, a dotted line marking the nearest creek, and one large empty space labeled the Promised Square. Liam felt a dizzying mix of terror and triumph. This empty land was everything he had and everything he hoped to be. It was the inheritance he had failed to find in Ireland, and the only one he could now offer his children. When they finally crested the last rise, the sight was not a welcoming landscape, but a challenge. There was no village, no fence, no familiar stone wall, only a terrifying, infinite ocean of grass. The prairie stretched to the horizon, a sea of big bluestem and switchgrass, rippling brown and gold under the high sun. The sheer scale was unnerving. "Where is the forest, Liam?" Moira whispered, her hand instinctively shielding Ain's eyes from the glare. "Where are the neighbors?" Liam forced a hopeful grin. "The forest, my love, we will plant ourselves, and the neighbors, they will come." But his heart clenched. In this vastness, their wagon, their 2 horses, and their small collection of tools seemed pitiably small. They were tiny, fragile boats adrift in a colossal, indifferent wilderness. The first task was to claim their space. Liam drove the wooden stakes into the ground at the 4 corners of their quarter section, officially binding their destiny to the untamed territory. Then came the unpacking of dreams. Every item pulled from the wagon was an essential: a sack of seed corn, a single iron cooking pot, an axe wrapped carefully in burlap, and the family Bible. Finn, 7 years old, helped his father unload the canvas tent that would be their home until winter. Moira lovingly unwrapped a small, chipped porcelain doll, Ain's only luxury, and placed it carefully beneath the wagon. Each object was a declaration: "We are here to stay." Their possessions were few, but they represented their entire future, laid out vulnerably beneath the indifferent eye of the sky. The first and most urgent labor was shelter. Lacking timber on the treeless plains, they chose to build a sod house, a soddy. Liam drove the plow deep into the earth, cutting long, thick strips of prairie sod, roots and soil tightly bound. It was backbreaking work. But the true ceremonial moment, the sound that marked their departure from the old life and the start of the new, was the first axe fall. It was not a tree they cut, but a heavy log Liam had hauled 20 miles from the distant riverbank.